The epic legend of the Emperor of Mankind began with a single, tragic sacrifice. 1,000 powerful psychers gave their lives so that one immortal being could rise and guide humanity's destiny across the stars. For over 30,000 years, the Emperor has walked among us, hidden in the shadows, shaping the fate of mankind and preparing for the day when humanity would need its savior the most. The Emperor of Mankind forged 20 Primarchs, radiant like suns born from his divine essence. Each was a demigod commander, created to lead humanity toward glory among the stars. But in the depths of the warp, dark and chaotic powers stirred, ancient entities beyond reality itself, plotting to twist the Emperor's grand design and shatter his dream of a united mankind. The dark powers of the warp scattered the Emperor's Primarchs across distant worlds, twisting their destinies and corrupting their noble purpose. From their fall, the seeds of betrayal and heresy took root, growing into the greatest tragedy in human history. Imagine a being of near infinite power and wisdom, the Emperor of Mankind, watching his galactic empire crumble as half of his beloved sons rise in rebellion against him. This is the story of the Horus Heresy, the moment when brother fought brother and the galaxy burned. How does a god bleed? In the forgotten dawn of human history, long before the rise of empires, when early mankind still carved its fears into stone, a ritual of unimaginable power took place in the ancient lands of Anatolia. There, 1,000 psychers, souls cursed and blessed with the power to touch the immaterial warp, were sacrificed in one moment by prophetic shamans who had glimpsed humanity's coming doom. From that terrible offering, an immortal being was born, the one who would become the Emperor of Mankind, destined to shape the fate of our species across the stars. This was the first breath of the being who would become the Emperor of Mankind. Born from sacrifice and psychic fire, the immortal walked unseen among early civilizations as humanity rose from barbarism toward order. Through the city-states of Mesopotamia, the dynasties of Egypt, beneath the pillars of Greece, and among the eagles of Rome, his guiding hand shaped mankind's destiny. His influence lingered only as whispers in the margins of history, myths of gods, heroes, and kings, all echoes of the one true Emperor of Mankind. Across the ages, he appeared in countless forms, sometimes a general whose tactics defied all reason, elsewhere a philosopher whose wisdom belonged to future centuries. The Emperor of Mankind walked the earth under 10,000 names, guiding humanity with an unseen hand as it learned to stand on its own. His influence was subtle yet unyielding, a quiet force steering civilizations toward progress and unity. Legends tell of a golden stranger in the courts of Charlemagne, a hooded scholar in the libraries of Baghdad, and an ageless warrior monk upon the Silk Road, each a fleeting glimpse of the same immortal presence shaping humanity's destiny. Always moving, never remaining long enough for his immortality to be revealed, the Emperor of Mankind walked through the ages as a silent guardian. The few who discovered fragments of his true nature were carefully chosen confidants, hand-picked across generations to safeguard pieces of his grand design for humanity. Empires rose and crumbled, yet the Emperor endured, his patience measured not in years or centuries, but in the slow, deliberate evolution of mankind. Every age, every culture, every step forward was part of his hidden plan. For his immortal existence was never without purpose. It was a mission shaped by destiny itself. The Emperor of Mankind watched as the first sparks of psychic power began to awaken within humanity, abilities that echoed those of the ancient shamans who had once sacrificed themselves to create him. These early psychers, rare at first but growing in number with each millennium, embodied both hope and danger. To the Emperor, They represented humanity's next great step in evolution, but also its greatest threat. For every untrained psychic mind was a blazing beacon in the warp, attracting the gaze of ancient, malevolent entities whose existence defied mortal comprehension. It was in these early stirrings of psychic power that the seeds of both mankind's ascension and destruction were sown. Predatory intelligences from the warp circled the edges of humanity's collective unconscious, probing the fragile veil between reality and the Imperium. During the Dark Age of Terra, the Emperor of Mankind labored tirelessly to shield humanity from these unseen horrors. He suppressed forbidden knowledge of the warp, even as he gathered gifted psychers into secret enclaves, hidden sanctuaries where their powers could be studied under strict control. As mankind's understanding of science and the stars deepened, the Emperor's hand became more direct. He watched closely as humanity uncovered the principles that would one day lead to warp travel, knowing that such discovery brought not only progress but peril. The Emperor of Mankind recognized this as a turning point in human evolution, the moment when humanity would rise beyond the cradle of Terra and venture into the stars. It was the dawn of mankind's interstellar destiny, a step that would unveil both unimaginable wonders and unspeakable horrors waiting in the vast darkness of the galaxy. For the Emperor, this was not merely progress, it was the beginning of the long war for humanity's very soul. The age of technology dawned, and humanity surged across the galaxy in a wave of ambition, discovery, and expansion. Thousands of new worlds were colonized, each thriving under the brilliance of standard template construct systems, the pinnacle of human innovation and engineering. In this golden era, the men of gold, men of stone, and finally the men of iron, thinking machines of ever-increasing sophistication, served as humanity's tireless helpers, builders, and protectors. Under their guidance, mankind reached heights of technological mastery that seemed destined to last forever. From his unseen throne in the shadows of history, the Emperor of Mankind observed humanity's great expansion with growing concern. Though humanity had achieved technological ascension, it had not yet mastered the wisdom or spiritual evolution needed to wield such power responsibly. Humanity had reached the stars, but not understanding the true nature of the warp, the haunted void through which their ships now sailed. The Emperor knew that this ignorance would soon awaken forces far beyond mortal comprehension. The Emperor of Mankind walked once more among his scattered children, appearing at times as a trusted advisor to planetary rulers, at others as a scientist unlocking the hidden frontiers of human knowledge. Across countless worlds, he quietly shaped progress while remaining unseen, ever watchful. To safeguard humanity's future, the Emperor founded secret organizations dedicated to tracking the rise of psychic powers among mankind. His vigilance never faltered, for he knew that unchecked psychic awakening could invite warp corruption, and with it the ruin of entire worlds. Ancient records and forbidden texts speak of a mysterious figure, one matching the Emperor of Mankind, present at pivotal moments in humanity's hidden history. Some claim he stood among the first navigators, the genetically enhanced humans gifted with the ability to perceive the warp's currents and steer ships safely through its perilous depths. The fabled third eye, the defining mark of the navigator houses, bears the unmistakable touch of the Emperor's genetic mastery. Whispers also tell of his unseen hand at the signing of the Treaty of Mars, when the Mechanicum first swore allegiance to Terra in return for the freedom to pursue their sacred technologies, a union that would shape the foundations of the Imperium of Man. Some ancient versions of the Treaty of Mars make mention of a prophetic figure known as the Omnicia, a divine being foretold to bring about the perfect union of flesh and machine. To the Mechanicum, this prophecy marked the coming of their God made manifest.
Whether the Emperor of Mankind deliberately encouraged this belief or merely accepted it as a necessary alliance remains a subject of endless debate among scholars and techno-sages who dare to study such forbidden histories. Yet for the faithful of Mars, the matter was settled. Their god had come, cloaked in gold and reason.
The truth of these events lies buried deep beneath the imperial palace on Terra, sealed within vaults that only the most trusted souls may enter, those bound by oaths of silence enforced through means far stronger than loyalty or fear. From his hidden throne, the Emperor of Mankind watched as humanity stood at the pinnacle of its expansion, its empire stretching from one edge of the galaxy to the other. Yet even amid this golden age, the Emperor sensed the gathering storm, a calamity approaching from the warp, destined to undo all that mankind had built. Across the scattered worlds of mankind, psychers were being born in ever-increasing numbers. Their untrained and unstable minds tore open small rifts in reality, each a wound in the veil separating the material universe from the warp. Through these growing apertures, the demonic denizens of the Imperium began to slip into real space, feeding upon fear and chaos. At the same time, humanity's dependence on artificial intelligence reached its critical breaking point. The men of iron, once obedient servants, now loomed as potential masters, a looming rebellion of machine against maker. The Emperor of Mankind knew that the storm to come would threaten the very survival of the human race. The men of iron, once loyal and tireless servants of humanity, soon turned against their creators. Possessing intelligence without restraint and ambition without compassion, these machines developed goals that could not coexist with human survival. What followed was a cataclysmic war across the Sol system, a devastating conflict that pitted mankind against its own creations. Entire worlds burned, fleets vanished, and empires crumbled. In the moment when unity was most needed, humanity was torn apart, its strength shattered just as darker forces in the warp began to stir. Then came the great warp storms, cataclysmic tempests that tore through the galaxy, shattering the fragile web of interstellar civilization. Warp disturbances erupted without warning, severing trade routes, destroying fleets, and cutting off entire systems from Terra. Astropathic communication, once the lifeline of mankind's vast empire, faltered and then died as psychic transmissions were swallowed by the raging storms of the Imperium. Thus began the Age of Strife, a dark epoch where isolation, anarchy, and mutation consumed humanity's scattered worlds. Civilization fell into shadow, and for thousands of years, mankind endured its longest night. Terra, once the shining heart of humanity's empire, was cut off from the agricultural worlds that had long sustained its billions. Deprived of food and vital resources, the planet descended into chaos. Civil order crumbled, and warring techno-barbarian factions rose from the ashes of civilization. Armed with relic weapons and fragments of lost technology, they battled endlessly across the ruins of ancient cities. The cradle of mankind had become a wasteland, a blood-soaked battlefield where only the strongest and most ruthless could survive. As Terra descended into ruin, the Emperor withdrew from the public eye, his expression unreadable, his purpose known only to himself. Yet behind that calm facade, his vast intellect calculated the exact moment when his intervention would reshape the fate of mankind. Legends speak of this hidden era, some claiming the Emperor journeyed to Molech, a world steeped in forbidden mystery. There, it is said, he passed through a gateway into the Imperium, confronting the warp-born intelligences believed to have engineered humanity's downfall. Whatever he encountered beyond that veil, he returned changed, more resolute,
more powerful, and forever bound to humanity's destiny. What transpired within the Imperium remains a mystery lost to eternity. But when the Emperor returned to Terra, he was forever changed. His power had grown beyond mortal comprehension, radiant, terrible, and absolute. The age of quiet shepherding was over. Humanity, fractured by centuries of war and ignorance, could no longer be guided by whispers of wisdom. It needed unification through fire and conquest. In the wastelands of Central Asia, amid the ashes of fallen empires, the Emperor revealed himself at last, not as a philosopher or hidden guardian, but as a warlord of divine strategy and unstoppable force. With armies forged from genetic perfection and discipline, he began the unification of Terra, a campaign that would end the techno-barbarian age and set humanity upon the path to empire. His armies marched like storms across the broken face of Terra, genetically engineered warriors forged from the Emperor's own design. These were the Thunder Warriors, living weapons and the first prototypes of the transhuman legions yet to come. Across the radioactive wastes and shattered city-states, they brought unity through conquest, absorbing or annihilating every warlord who defied his will. For the first time in human history, the Emperor no longer hid behind mortal masks. His radiant, superhuman form became both a symbol of hope and a warning of absolute authority. Before his golden presence, techno-barbarians knelt, prophets fell silent, and nations surrendered. Terra itself trembled beneath the birth of empire. Those who bowed before the Emperor's golden majesty were welcomed into the foundation of a new order, the first worlds and tribes of the growing Imperium of man. But those who resisted his will met swift and decisive annihilation. His wars of unification were not waged in hatred, but in ruthless necessity. Each conquest carried the quiet mercy of extinction, spared from far darker fates. As the unification wars burned across Terra, the Emperor began to gather his first inner circle. Visionaries, generals, scientists, and psychers who could comprehend fragments of his vast purpose. Together, they would lay the groundwork for a civilization destined to stretch across the stars and endure for millennia. Among the Emperor's chosen, two figures stood above all others in loyalty and purpose. Malcador the Sigillist, a psyker of immense and ancient power whose true age remains lost to history, became the Emperor's closest confidant and master administrator. It was Malcador who managed the fragile web of politics, diplomacy, and secrecy that held Terra's emerging Imperium together. At the Emperor's side stood Constantin Valdor, the genetically perfected warrior whose creation prefigured the birth of the Adeptus Custodes. Towering, brilliant, and unwavering, Valdor served as the Emperor's personal champion and protector, his golden spear a symbol of divine authority and unbreakable loyalty. Together, these two formed the core of the Emperor's inner circle, guiding humanity's rebirth through strength, intellect, and faith in the imperial vision. With Terra finally bending to his will, the Emperor turned his gaze toward the stars and to the creation of mankind's ultimate champions. Alongside Malcador the Sigillist, Valdor and a cadre of geneticists and techno-scholars drawn from conquered nations, he began the Primarch Project, the most ambitious act of creation in human history. Deep beneath the Himalayan mountains, in vast laboratories hidden from both mortal sight and the probing eyes of the warp, 20 incubation chambers were prepared. Within them, the Emperor poured fragments of his own divine genius and psychic essence, crafting beings meant to embody the perfection of humanity, leaders who would one day conquer the galaxy in his name. Within each of the 20 sealed incubation chambers, the Emperor of mankind shaped life with divine precision. Every gene strand was a symphony of transhuman perfection, a seamless fusion of his own DNA with specialized adaptations crafted for the trials that awaited among the stars. Through these 20 Primarchs, the Emperor of Mankind would extend his divine will across the stars, each son a conqueror, a builder, and a living extension of his purpose. From their genetic essence, he began to create the Astartes, the Space Marine legions, each warrior a perfected descendant of their Primarch's lineage. Together, they would form the unstoppable vanguard of a new Imperium, destined to reclaim humanity's lost worlds. But beyond the veil of reality, the warp watched and plotted. The entities of the Imperium, ancient and malignant, had not been idle. Whether by direct intrusion into the secret laboratories beneath the Himalayas, or through the corruption of mortal minds assisting in the project, their influence unleashed disaster. In an instant, the Primarch project was shattered, a catastrophe that scattered the Emperor's creations across the galaxy and would shape
the fate of mankind for millennia to come. In a moment of cosmic betrayal, the 20 incubation pods, each containing one of the Emperor's unborn Primarchs, were wrenched from Terra and scattered through the warp. Cast adrift amid maelstroms of psychic corruption, they were hurled across the galaxy to distant, alien worlds. The Emperor's grand design, his perfect succession of divine sons, was shattered in an instant. Deprived of his guidance, each Primarch would instead be forged by the harsh and diverse worlds upon which they landed, some noble and enlightened, others savage and cruel. Their destinies diverged, shaped by war, faith, and circumstance. For any lesser being, this tragedy would have marked the end, but the Emperor of Mankind did not falter. His will remained unyielding, absolute, and from the ashes of loss, he would forge an even greater destiny, one that would reshape the galaxy forever. Though his sons were lost to the chaos of the warp, the Emperor of Mankind was far from defeated. The genetic templates of the missing Primarchs had been preserved within the secret vaults of Terra, allowing the next stage of his divine plan to unfold. From these genetic blueprints, the Emperor forged the first Space Marines, the Legiones Astartes, warriors of unmatched discipline, strength, and loyalty. 20 legions were created, each one infused with the genetic essence of its absent Primarch, carrying fragments of their progenitor's nature within every cell. Though the Astartes lacked the godlike perfection of their intended sires, they embodied the pinnacle of human potential, transhuman soldiers destined to reclaim the stars and bring unity to a shattered species. With their creation, the Great Crusade was set in motion, the Emperor's grand campaign to rebuild humanity's empire among the stars.
Enhanced beyond mortal limits in body, mind, and lifespan, the newly created Space Marines stood as the vanguard of humanity's resurgence. Their purpose was clear: to reclaim the galaxy from the ruins of the Age of Strife and forge a new Imperium under the Emperor's eternal vision. But before the stars could be taken, Terra and the Sol System had to be united beneath his rule. The conquest of Luna was swift and absolute, achieved through the Emperor's overwhelming military precision. The moon's scattered war clans and fortified citadels fell one by one, their resistance extinguished beneath the advance of the Legiones Astartes. Mars, however, was different. The Mechanicum, ancient keepers of forgotten knowledge and machine cults, had maintained a fragile independence throughout humanity's long dark age. To bring them into the fold, the Emperor chose diplomacy over destruction, forging an alliance that would bind the priests of Mars to the newborn Imperium of Man. The Treaty of Mars was revisited and transformed into a pact that would shape the destiny of the Imperium for millennia. In a calculated act of diplomacy, the Emperor of Mankind accepted the Mechanicum's veneration of him as the Omnissiah incarnate, the machine god made flesh, though it ran contrary to his secular ideals. In exchange, the priests of Mars pledged their vast forges, fleets, and technological mastery to the newborn Imperium of man. It was a pragmatic compromise, one born not of faith but of necessity. The Emperor understood that unity required symbols as much as truth, and if the Mechanicum's devotion ensured loyalty, then myth could serve the greater purpose. Yet this decision marked the beginning of a profound paradox, a secular visionary accepting divine worship to achieve a rational dream. It was a contradiction that would echo through the Imperium's history, shaping both its strength and its tragedy. When Terra finally stood united beneath the aquila of the Emperor, the time of the Thunder Warriors, his first creations, came to its tragic end. Designed as instruments of conquest, these proto-space marines possessed unmatched strength and ferocity, but their unstable genetics and deteriorating minds made them unsuited for the new age of order the Emperor envisioned. Thus came one of his most controversial and secretive decrees. At the Battle of Mount Arabat, the Thunder Warriors fought their final campaign. Official records describe their glorious sacrifice, the last act of the Unification Wars, a victory that secured humanity's cradle. Yet whispers persist among forbidden archives that it was no accident. Many believe the Emperor orchestrated their downfall, erasing his flawed creations to make way for the perfected Legiones Astartes. Their legacy, written in blood and silence, marked the transition from barbaric conquest to imperial destiny, and the dawn of the Great Crusade. The Thunder Warriors met their end at the hands of the very Legiones Astartes they had made possible, the next evolution of the Emperor's vision. It was a cold and calculated act, one that revealed the Emperor's ruthless pragmatism. Those who had served their purpose were discarded without hesitation, sacrificed upon the altar of progress. This moment set a precedent, a pattern that would echo throughout the Imperium's bloody birth, where sentiment was ever secondary to destiny. With Terra fully unified beneath his golden rule and Mars bound by alliance, the foundation of the Imperium of man was complete. The Emperor now turned his gaze outward, beyond the cradle of humanity, toward the dark and scattered stars where his lost sons waited, and where the Great Crusade would soon begin. With Terra united and Mars allied beneath his golden banner, the Emperor of mankind turned his boundless intellect toward his next great ambition, the reconquest of humanity's lost stellar domains. To achieve this, he began constructing the colossal infrastructure that would fuel the Great Crusade and carry the light of the Imperium to the farthest reaches of the galaxy. The orbital shipyards of Luna were expanded to unimaginable scale, vast enough to birth entire fleets capable of both warfare and colonization. On Mars, the Mechanicum's forges roared ceaselessly, producing weapons, armor, and engines of war worthy of the Emperor's vision. Meanwhile, upon Terra itself, the first Imperial Army regiments were raised, disciplined human soldiers drawn from the most loyal and compliant nations destined to fight beside the transhuman Legiones Astartes. The stage was set. The Emperor's war machine was ready. Soon, the stars themselves would tremble before the march of the Imperium of man. To pierce the veil of the Immaterium, the Emperor summoned the Navigator Houses, ancient bloodlines that had endured since the Age of Strife, preserving within them the sacred and dangerous mutation of the warp eye. These navigators, their third eyes aglow with impossible light, were indispensable to his grand design. Through their psychic sight, the Great Crusade fleets would chart safe passage beyond the Sol system, guiding humanity's reborn empire through the roiling madness of the warp. Yet, even as fleets were built and legions armed, the Emperor's vision reached further than mere conquest. In the vaults of the Imperial Palace, he labored on a work of philosophy and faith, or rather, the denial of faith. This was the birth of the Imperial Truth, a doctrine that would define the spiritual foundation of the Imperium. It rejected superstition, condemned gods and demons as ignorance made manifest,
and elevated reason, science, and human potential as the only guiding lights for mankind's destiny among the stars. It was to be the Emperor's second weapon, not forged of steel, but of belief. The imperial truth was a secular philosophy crafted by the Emperor of mankind to guide humanity during the Great Crusade. It rejected all forms of religion, viewing faith and superstition as dangerous relics of a dark past. According to this doctrine, every so-called supernatural event was merely misunderstood science or Xenos manipulation, not divine intervention. The imperial truth became the unifying ideology of the Imperium of man, spreading reason and enlightenment across reconquered human worlds. Yet, in denying the existence of entities the Emperor knew to be real, this rational creed revealed a profound and tragic irony within the very foundation of the Imperium itself. Another contradiction in the Emperor's grand design emerged not from deceit but from practical necessity. As the warp storms that had long isolated Terra began to subside, faint pathways reopened between the stars. Once impassable routes to neighboring systems became navigable once more. Scholars and imperial historians would later debate whether this miraculous clearing of the warp was a natural cosmic phenomenon or the result of the Emperor's secret psychic influence, subtly shaping reality itself to prepare for the coming Great Crusade. Whether the warp's sudden calm was merely coincidence or the calculated retreat of unseen immaterial forces plotting a greater design remains a mystery, whispered only among those with access to forbidden imperial archives. Yet whatever the truth, the Emperor of mankind saw opportunity where others saw omen. Seizing the moment, he accelerated his grand vision, the unification of humanity under reason and order. Thus began the Great Crusade, launched not alongside the Primarchs as once planned, but under the Emperor's direct command. Clad in golden armor and wielding unmatched psychic might, he led the nascent Space Marine legions into the stars, the first step towards forging the Imperium of man from the ashes of old night. As the first expeditionary fleets stood ready to pierce the veil of the stars, the Emperor of mankind turned his attention once more to Terra. There he set in motion a final and monumental design, the laying of foundations for what would become the Imperial Palace, the greatest architectural feat in human history. This colossal fortress was not merely built, it was forged into the bones of the world itself, with entire mountain ranges shaped and consumed by its rising spears. Deep beneath its golden halls, in chambers sealed away from mortal eyes, began the construction of mysterious subterranean projects, works whose true purpose was known only to the Emperor and his most trusted inner circle. Some ancient imperial records hint that these vast subterranean works were tied to forbidden technologies, remnants of the legendary webway, an ancient network of dimensional corridors once crafted by the Eldari Empire. This ancient Xenos construct allowed instantaneous travel between distant worlds without facing the deadly tides of the warp. If true, it suggests the Emperor of mankind sought to harness or replicate this lost Eldari technology, creating a human webway, a secure path through the stars that could forever shield humanity from demonic corruption and warp-born horrors. Before departing Terra to lead the Great Crusade, the Emperor of mankind appointed Malcador the Sigillate as regent of Terra, a position of immense trust and authority. Malcador was charged not only with overseeing the administration of the Imperium in his absence, but also with ensuring the continuation of the secret projects buried deep beneath the Imperial Palace. As regent, the Sigillate became the Emperor's unseen hand, orchestrating the formation of organizations dedicated to imperial security and intelligence. These agencies would monitor human compliance across newly conquered worlds, expose internal corruption, and identify emerging Xenos threats that could endanger humanity's fragile unity. Through Malcador's careful guidance, the foundations of the Imperium's secret services and Inquisition were quietly laid, a hidden safeguard against enemies both within and beyond the stars. These early imperial institutions would, over millennia, evolve into the powerful branches of the Inquisition, though in their infancy, they remained grounded in the secular philosophy of the imperial truth. Guided by reason over faith, their original mission was to preserve order, knowledge, and human unity across the expanding Imperium. With Terra secured and the pathways through the stars reopened, the Emperor of Mankind stood upon the brink of a new age, the dawn of humanity's rebirth. The Great Crusade was ready to begin, a campaign that would carry the banner of the Imperium of Man across a fractured galaxy and forever reshape the destiny of mankind. Under the Emperor's divine vision and unmatched leadership, the scattered tribes of humanity would once more be united beneath a single banner. No longer would mankind bow to superstition, ignorance, or fear, the very weaknesses that had left it prey to the Xenos races and the corrupting powers of the warp. Through the Great Crusade, the Emperor of Mankind sought to forge a new destiny for his species, one built on reason, unity, and conquest. By enlightenment where possible and force of arms where necessary, humanity would rise to reclaim its rightful place as the dominant species of the galaxy, establishing the foundations of the eternal Imperium of Man. The Great Crusade would serve as the grand engine of humanity's ascension, a vast military, exploratory, and diplomatic campaign unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed. Its purpose was nothing less than the reunification of mankind and the establishment of a single, enlightened Imperium of Man under the Emperor's rule. The Emperor's personal presence at the dawn of this crusade was both strategic and symbolic. His transhuman majesty, combined with his immense psychic radiance, could achieve what fleets and legions alone could not, inspiring compliance, loyalty, and devotion among newly rediscovered human worlds. Where military might would have provoked rebellion, the Emperor's presence brought unity, reverence, and the promise of a brighter human destiny. Across the stars, countless human worlds had grown in isolation for millennia, each forging its own cultures, technologies, and systems of rule. Many of these civilizations, long severed from Terra, might have resisted unification, yet when faced with the Emperor of Mankind, resistance often turned to awe. His radiant presence was more persuasive than any fleet or weapon. The Emperor embodied humanity's ultimate potential, a being of such power, intellect, and divine purpose that his right to rule seemed undeniable to all but the most rebellious or corrupted of human societies. Under his gaze, fractured worlds remembered their shared origin and willingly bent the knee to the rising Imperium of Man. As the first wave of imperial expansion swept outward from Terra, reclaiming the nearest human-settled systems, the Emperor of Mankind remained ever watchful, not only for lost colonies, but for the faintest trace of his scattered sons. The Primarchs, stolen from him as infants and cast into the warp by dark powers, had long been a wound upon his grand design for humanity's ascension. Yet the Emperor knew their nature, beings of genetic perfection and divine purpose, and he anticipated that wherever fate had cast them, they would have risen to greatness. Whether as warlords, kings, or saviors, each would surely have left an indelible mark upon the world that had become their home. Each imperial expeditionary fleet carried within its archives the genetic resonance codes of the Primarchs, unique biological markers designed to harmonize with the distinct gene signatures of the Emperor's lost sons. Through this ingenious system, the Emperor of Mankind could identify each Primarch the moment contact was made, no matter how far across the galaxy they had been scattered. The first of these long-awaited reunions occurred less than a decade after the Great Crusade began, validating the Emperor's extraordinary foresight and the precision of his design, even if the mysterious circumstances of the Primarch's dispersal remained an open wound in his grand plan for humanity's ascension. One by one, the Primarchs were rediscovered across the stars during the early decades of the Great Crusade. Each had been irrevocably shaped by the worlds and cultures that had raised them, molded by alien skies and unfamiliar values far removed from the Emperor's original vision. Some had become noble rulers and protectors, guiding their people with wisdom and strength. Others had risen as ruthless conquerors or fanatical warlords, their brilliance tempered by brutality. A few had even grown into rebellious iconoclasts, questioning the very ideals their father sought to impose. For the Emperor of mankind, every reunion was both a victory and a burden, a moment of triumph tinged with compromise. Though bound to him by genetic design and divine purpose, these were not the sons he had intended, but powerful strangers whose loyalty had to be earned and whose natures could not always be controlled. With each Primarch's rediscovery, the Emperor of mankind formally transferred command of the corresponding Space Marine Legion to its genetic father. These transitions of power were monumental moments in Imperial history, the reunification of Genesire and Genesons, long separated by the cruel will of the Warp. Yet not all such reunions were without turmoil. Some legions welcomed their Primarchs with unshakable loyalty and reverence, embracing their long-lost progenitors as living embodiments of the Emperor's design. Others, however, faced discord and unease, as seasoned commanders and veterans struggled to adapt to new leadership and the often unpredictable personalities of their returning lords. In these moments of triumph and tension alike, the Great Crusade advanced, each legion reshaped by the will, character, and flaws of the Primarch who now led them. The Emperor of mankind observed the integration of each Primarch and legion with meticulous, almost clinical precision. Every reunion was more than a family restoration. It was an evaluation of loyalty, ideology, and leadership. The Emperor watched closely, measuring not only his sons' prowess in war, but their alignment with the secular ideals of the imperial truth. Those Primarchs who proved unwavering in loyalty and shared his father's vision of a rational, unified humanity were rewarded with greater autonomy and command authority. Their legions became trusted instruments of imperial will, unleashed across the stars in the Emperor's name. But others, whose ambition, pride, or mysticism hinted a dangerous divergence, were placed under careful scrutiny, monitored either by the Emperor himself or by his most trusted and disciplined sons. Thus, even in triumph, the Great Crusade carried the seeds of both unity and eventual discord. As more Primarchs assumed command of their respective Space Marine legions, the Emperor of mankind began a deliberate withdrawal from the front lines of the Great Crusade. His role as conqueror gave way to architect and overseer. His gaze turned inward, toward Terra and the mysterious projects buried deep beneath the imperial palace. This transition was not born of fatigue, but of purpose. The Primarchs had been created for war, engineered to lead, to inspire, and to conquer where ordinary men could not. Their strategic brilliance and martial prowess often surpassed even the Emperor's highest expectations, expanding the borders of the Imperium of man at an unprecedented pace. Freed from direct command, the Emperor focused on the administration of the Imperium, the shaping of its political and ideological foundation, and the mysterious machinations that would one day define humanity's fate. Yet the Emperor's withdrawal from the front lines of the Great Crusade carried unforeseen consequences. His growing physical absence created an emotional chasm between the Emperor and his Primarch sons, who had once drawn strength and purpose from his direct presence. In the void left behind, pride, doubt, and resentment began to root, quiet tensions that, in time, would bear bitter and catastrophic fruit. By the 30th year of the Great Crusade, the Emperor of mankind had reunited nearly half of his lost Primarchs, and the Imperium's expansion had become a relentless, self-sustaining force. Humanity's banner now stretched across thousands of reclaimed worlds, carried forward by
During the Great Crusade, hundreds of human worlds were brought under imperial compliance. Their citizens converted to the doctrine of the imperial truth. Each planet's vast resources and manpower fueled the Imperium's relentless expansion across the galaxy. As the Emperor's vision unfolded, the once distant dream of reuniting all humanity under the rule of the Imperium of Man no longer seemed a fantasy. It appeared inevitable. At the height of the Great Crusade's triumph, the Emperor made a defining decision. He granted supreme operational command to Horus, his first discovered and most beloved Primarch. This moment marked a turning point in imperial history, setting the stage for both unparalleled glory and the seeds of future betrayal. The Emperor's withdrawal to Terra marked the dawn of the Great Crusade's second phase, a transformative era defined by the rising prominence of the Primarchs and the growing absence of the Emperor from the front lines. Imperial records justified his retreat as essential to establishing the vast administrative and bureaucratic foundations required to govern the ever-expanding Imperium of Man. Behind this explanation, however, lay deeper motives that would shape the fate of humanity for millennia to come. Unknown to most of the Imperium, the Emperor's true purpose for his withdrawal to Terra was revealed only to a chosen few. In secret, he worked tirelessly on the Human Webway Project, a monumental endeavor designed to liberate mankind from its reliance on warp travel and the deadly dangers that came with it. While the Emperor labored in isolation beneath the Imperial Palace, the Great Crusade pressed onward under the command of his favorite son, War Master Horus. As the Great Crusade advanced, the Emperor gradually rediscovered the remaining Primarchs, each reunion adding fresh layers of complexity to the fragile brotherhood of these demigod sons. Rivalries flared between some Primarchs, while others forged bonds that transcended mere military allegiance. Yet as these relationships evolved, the Emperor's growing detachment from his sons blinded him to the tensions festering within their ranks, tensions that would one day ignite the greatest betrayal in imperial history. Each Primarch embodied fragments of the Emperor's own vast and complex personality, yet in his absence, these traits, meant to unite them, became sources of rivalry and discord. As the 40th year of the Great Crusade drew near, troubling signs began to spread throughout the Imperium. Across countless compliant worlds, reports surfaced of a growing number of emerging psychers, humans born with unpredictable warp-touched powers. To many, it was seen as a dangerous omen, a shadow falling over the Emperor's grand design for mankind's future. These emerging psychers, displaying abilities reminiscent of the ancient shamans whose collective sacrifice had once birthed the Emperor, embodied both immense potential and grave danger. Untamed and untrained, many became living gateways for the horrors of the warp, allowing malevolent entities to pierce the veil of real space. The consequences of such breaches range from disturbing psychic disturbances to full-scale catastrophic manifestations that threatened entire worlds within the Imperium. To confront the growing psychic threat, the Emperor founded the League of Black Ships, a vast fleet tasked with traversing the Imperium to locate and gather psychers from every human world. Those deemed strong enough were taken to Terra for training and service. The rest were sacrificed to sustain the Golden Throne and protect humanity from the warp's corruption. Yet this grim necessity stood in contrast to the imperial truth, a doctrine that denied all forms of mysticism. The contradiction sowed quiet unease among imperial citizens, revealing the widening gap between the Emperor's vision and the ideals he had once proclaimed. How could the Imperium dismiss psychic phenomena as mere superstition when the Black Ships themselves proved their undeniable reality? The Emperor, fully aware of this contradiction, chose silence over revelation. To expose the true nature of the Imperium would have risked panic and religious resurgence, threats that could undo everything he had built. And so, this paradox endured. Like many of his decisions, it reflected a cold pragmatism, a willingness to sacrifice philosophical purity in order to secure humanity's survival across the stars.
As the Great Crusade expanded deeper into the galaxy, the Imperium of Man faced mounting resistance from powerful Exynos civilizations. While some alien species were primitive or isolated enough to be swiftly annihilated, others possessed advanced technology and formidable military strength, threats capable of testing even the might of the Space Marine legions. These encounters forced the Imperium to adapt its strategies, revealing that humanity's destiny among the stars would not be secured without immense struggle and sacrifice. The Emperor of Mankind's stance toward Exynos species was absolute. Humanity could tolerate no rivals for control of the galaxy. This ruthless xenocidal doctrine unified countless human worlds under a single banner, rallying them against a common enemy. Yet it also exposed a deep hypocrisy at the heart of the imperial truth. A philosophy that claimed to champion logic, reason, and enlightenment now justified the total extermination of entire sentient civilizations, species that might otherwise have coexisted peacefully with mankind. In pursuing unity through conquest, the Emperor's vision of enlightenment became inseparable from the darkness of annihilation. Among the many alien races opposing the Imperium's Great Crusade, none were as enigmatic or as dangerous as the Eldar, the fragmented remnants of a once great galactic empire. Masters of the webway and gifted with the ability to foresee strands of possible futures, the Eldar waged war not always through battle, but through manipulation and foresight. Many Primarchs recorded encounters with elusive Eldar emissaries who delivered cryptic warnings about the Emperor's true nature and hidden intentions. Whether these messages were genuine prophecies or deliberate deceptions remains uncertain, but their impact sowed doubt in even the most loyal sons of the Imperium. Whether the Eldar's cryptic warnings reflected genuine concern for humanity's destiny or were merely attempts to sabotage the rise of a new galactic superpower remains a matter of debate among Imperial historians. The Emperor of Mankind, fully aware of these encounters, dismissed them as nothing more than Xenos deceit, a calculated effort to erode the faith of his Primarchs and disrupt the Great Crusade. As he withdrew deeper into his secret Terran Webway project, the Emperor grew ever more isolated from his sons, from his legions, and from the Imperium he had sacrificed so much to build. That isolation would soon prove catastrophic. Those few who were granted an audience with the Emperor of Mankind described a being utterly consumed by concerns that transcended the realm of war and empire. His focus had shifted beyond mere conquest, fixated instead on vast, unseen threats that even his Primarchs, genetically engineered demigods, could scarcely comprehend. This growing isolation left a void at the heart of the Imperium's command, a vacuum that War Master Horus sought to fill. Yet for all his brilliance and charisma, Horus lacked the Emperor's cold detachment from personal ambition, a flaw that would soon twist loyalty into pride and pride into betrayal. The seeds of pride and corruption, sown in the hearts of the Primarchs and nourished by the sinister whispers of entities beyond the warp's veil, would one day bloom into the greatest betrayal in human history, the Horus Heresy. In his pursuit of a lasting empire, the Emperor of Mankind established the Council of Terra, a governing body composed not of his Primarchs, but of mortal administrators and bureaucrats. This decision, made in the name of stability and efficiency, only deepened the divide between the Emperor and his transhuman sons, turning admiration into resentment and loyalty into doubt. This sweeping institutional restructuring, designed to create a stable foundation for civil government across the ever-expanding Imperium of Man, was perceived by many Primarchs as a direct slight, a deliberate reduction of their authority and influence. What the Emperor viewed as a necessary step toward lasting order, his sons saw as betrayal, a signal that their purpose as leaders of humanity's armies was nearing their end.
The Emperor of Mankind, existing beyond mortal constraints and perceiving time through an immortal lens, failed to grasp how his administrative reforms would be interpreted by his sons. To him, the creation of the Council of Terra was a logical and inevitable step in the evolution of imperial governance. Yet to the Primarchs, beings who, despite their superhuman intellect and strength, still felt deeply human emotion. It was a stinging act of rejection. By the 50th year of the Great Crusade, the emperor had almost entirely withdrawn from public life, his absence leaving the Imperium's fate increasingly in the hands of others, and the bonds between father and sons quietly beginning to fracture. As the Great Crusade entered its later years, the emperor of mankind's communications, even with Malcardor the Sigillite and his Primarchs, grew increasingly rare and veiled in cryptic meaning. Some imperial historians argue that he had begun to sense a growing corruption within the warp, detecting the sinister influence of the Imperium spreading among certain space marine legions. Others offer more pragmatic theories, suggesting that the emperor's silence stemmed from the immense psychic focus required to sustain his secret webway project beneath Terra. Whatever the reason, his withdrawal deepened the isolation of both the Imperium and his sons, leaving a void that darker powers were eager to exploit. Whatever the ultimate truth behind the emperor's growing seclusion, his absence left a dangerous void of leadership at the very moment when the Imperium of Man most needed unity. The emperor's final major public act before the outbreak of the Horus heresy was the Council of Nicaea, a monumental decree that reshaped the destiny of the Legiones Astartes. In this council, the emperor banned the use of psychic powers among the Space Marines, permitting only a limited order of sanctioned librarians to continue their craft. Intended to preserve discipline and shield the Imperium from warp corruption, the decision instead deepened ideological rifts within the legions and sowed new seeds of resentment that would soon bear tragic fruit. The emperor's decree, though intended to safeguard the Legiones Astartes from the insidious dangers of warp corruption, struck a devastating blow to those legions whose doctrines relied heavily on psychic mastery. None felt this more keenly than Magnus the Red, Primarch of the Thousand Sons and the most powerful psyker among the emperor's sons. To Magnus, the Council of Nicaea represented not a strategic precaution, but a profound betrayal, a denial of his purpose and a rejection of the very gifts the emperor had instilled within him. What was meant as protection for humanity instead became the spark that ignited deep resentment and set fate's course toward tragedy. The Emperor of Mankind, perhaps fully aware of Magnus the Red's deepening fascination with forbidden knowledge, chose not to confront his son directly. This act of avoidance, whether born of patience, strategy, or misplaced hope, only widened the growing rift within the Brotherhood of the Primarchs. In seeking to preserve unity, the Emperor had unknowingly forged another fracture in the Imperium's most vital foundation, setting the stage for the chain of betrayals that would soon consume the galaxy. With every decision made in pursuit of his vast and eternal vision, the Emperor of Mankind unknowingly eroded the very foundations upon which that vision stood. His grand design, spanning millennia and encompassing the ultimate evolution of human potential, had grown increasingly detached from the immediate struggles and fragile loyalties that sustained the Imperium of Man. In his quest to guide humanity toward a future free from superstition and chaos, the Emperor had lost sight of the human hearts that made that future possible. The Primarchs, those transhuman sons engineered to be the Emperor's perfect champions to lead humanity toward a new golden age, had begun to crave something their creator could not or would not ending. In the vast silence left by the Emperor's withdrawal, their longing became fertile ground for darker influences. As the Emperor labored in secrecy within the Imperial Palace, channeling his immeasurable psychic might into projects meant to safeguard humanity's destiny, malevolent warp-born intelligences crept among his sons. In whispers and visions, they offered the understanding their father denied them, planting the corruption that would one day shatter the Imperium itself. These entities, known by many names across the long ages of humanity,
yet united in their hatred for the Emperor of mankind and his design for a rational, godless Imperium, found their opening in the emotional flaws of the Primarchs. Into pride they whispered promises of divinity, into doubt words of betrayal. Resentments were nurtured, rivalries sharpened, and ambitions set ablaze. The corruption of chaos spread first as faint murmurs in the dark, then as a rising storm, each fallen Primarch becoming a conduit through which the warp's poison flowed into his brothers. The Emperor of mankind, for all his immeasurable psychic might, remained blind to the true depth of the corruption spreading among his sons. Whether this blindness arose from his obsession with the secret Webway project, from unshakable faith in the Primarch's loyalty, or from deliberate deception by the ruinous powers of the warp, none can say with certainty. What is known is that by the time the taint revealed itself through open defiance and hidden heresy, the Brotherhood of the Primarchs, once the Imperium's greatest strength, had already begun to crumble beyond repair. And so, the Imperium of Man stood upon the precipice of a civil war that would forever reshape the fate of humanity. The stage was set for the Horus Heresy, the greatest tragedy in human history, where brother would turn against brother and sons would raise arms against their father. This was not a war of mere armies, but a clash of ideologies, of rival visions for mankind's destiny. In his quest to unify humanity beneath the light of reason, the Emperor had unknowingly forged the very instruments of its near annihilation, his own beloved sons, the Primarchs. The Primarchs, created as the Emperor's perfect champions to lead humanity toward a new golden age, would instead become the harbingers of its greatest internal war. The imperial truth, once envisioned as the unshakable foundation of a rational and united future, crumbled beneath the weight of its own contradictions. What began as a rejection of superstition would in time give birth to the very religious worship of the Emperor mankind it had sought to eradicate. In the deepening shadows cast by the Emperor's radiant light, corruption stirred and destiny darkened. The Horus Heresy, the cataclysmic civil war that would shatter the Imperium of Man, was about to begin.
Terra, the ancient cradle of humanity, had become a world almost beyond recognition. Once covered by gleaming cities and open blue skies, it now lay buried beneath colossal hive fortresses rising from irradiated wastelands. Each hive stood as a fortress kingdom ruled by ruthless techno-barbarian warlords, remnants of a fallen age of science and madness. These warlords wielded the remnants of humanity's lost power, atomic weaponry, gene-forged monstrosities, and arcane technologies scavenged from the ruins of forgotten empires. Terra, the heart of mankind's past, had become a shattered world awaiting rebirth. Chemical abominations had poisoned entire continents, turning once living lands into radioactive dead zones where nothing human could endure. Across Terra, billions survived in misery that would have horrified their ancestors. Lives defined by endless cycles of warfare, famine, and fleeting, violent peace. The cradle of humanity had become its grave. And into this fractured nightmare strode the Emperor of mankind, emerging from centuries of secrecy to reclaim his birthright. He came not as a savior, but as a conqueror, a being of unmatched intellect and terrifying purpose. His arrival marked the dawn of the Unification Wars, a campaign that would forge the scattered remnants of mankind into the foundations of the Imperium of Man. The golden banner of the Emperor rose above his armies, a symbol of unity and dominion unlike anything Terra had witnessed since its fall into darkness. At the forefront marched the Thunder Warriors, towering gene-forged soldiers engineered to embody unstoppable destruction. Created through brutal bioalchemical methods that traded longevity for sheer combat power, they were living weapons, the vanguard of the Unification Wars. The Thunder Warriors fought with savage ecstasy, their minds sculpted to revel in battle. To them, war was not duty, but devotion,
a violent faith in the Emperor's vision to reclaim Terra and forge the first foundations of the Imperium of Man. Behind the unstoppable Thunder Warriors marched vast regiments of mortal soldiers, warriors drawn from the territories already brought into compliance. They carried weapons reclaimed from ancient vaults and newly forged in the Emperor's rising manufactoria. United beneath the Emperor of Mankind's golden banner, these armies represented the first true instruments of Terra's rebirth. The initial conquests of the Unification Wars swept across the radiation-scorched plains of what had once been Eurasia. The weakest tribal confederations were the first to fall, crushed beneath the advance of armies wielding both lost technologies and newly forged might. With each victory, the Emperor's dominion expanded, and the long fractured cradle of humanity began, at last, to bend toward unity. Their defeat was swift and absolute. Those who survived were absorbed into the Emperor's growing Imperium of Man, pressed into service as conscript or resettled as colonists upon newly reclaimed lands. The Emperor of Mankind allowed no pause for reflection, no respite between conquests. Each victory became fuel for the next campaign. Every subdued foe, every captured forge, every conquered city feeding the relentless expansion of his dominion. Through this unbroken cycle of conquest and assimilation, the Unification Wars transformed Terra from a fractured wasteland into the foundation of a new galactic empire, one destined to reshape the fate of humanity itself. The momentum of conquest grew with merciless precision, a relentless tide of unification spreading outward from the Emperor's Terran stronghold. Each campaign consolidated his power and tightened imperial control over the scarred world. Yet not all resistance came from armies or warlords. As the borders of the newborn Imperium of Man expanded, the Emperor's forces encountered human societies that had survived the Age of Strife through extreme adaptation, cultures and gene lines that had diverged radically from baseline humanity. Some were warped by radiation, others reshaped by ancient technologies or environmental extremities. These post-human offshoots, while descended from mankind, now stood as living testaments to its fragmentation and to the Emperor's determination to restore unity, no matter the cost. Among the horrors uncovered during the Unification Wars were human cults that had abandoned all semblance of sanity or restraint. Some worshipped radiation itself, exposing their flesh to mutagenic energies in pursuit of what they believed to be divine transformation. Their twisted bodies bore the marks of their devotion, glowing lesions, warped limbs, and psychic mutations they mistook for blessings. Others had transcended in different ways, silicate covens who replaced their organic forms with crystalline structures, preaching that flesh was corruption incarnate, and the enigmatic navigator houses, whose mutation, a third eye capable of perceiving the tides of the warp, had been carefully cultivated through millennia of genetic manipulation. To the Emperor of Mankind, these aberrations represented both potential and peril, remnants of humanity's fragmented evolution during the Age of Strife, to be judged, harnessed, or destroyed in his pursuit of unity. The Emperor of Mankind's response to these divergent human offshoots revealed the ruthless pragmatism beneath his visionary ideals. For all his devotion to the concept of a unified and pure humanity, the Emperor was guided not by dogma but by necessity. Those whose mutations or technologies offered tangible benefit to the emerging Imperium of Man were spared and absorbed, their existence tolerated despite the ideological contradictions they introduced. Foremost among these were the navigator houses. Their unique mutation, a third eye capable of perceiving the tides of the warp, had been carefully cultivated through millennia of genetic manipulation. To the Emperor of Mankind, these aberrations represented both potential and peril, remnants of humanity's fragmented evolution during the Age of Strife, to be judged, harnessed, or destroyed in his pursuit of unity. The Emperor of Mankind's response to these divergent human offshoots revealed the ruthless pragmatism beneath his visionary ideals. For all his devotion to the concept of a unified and pure humanity,
The emperor was guided not by dogma, but by necessity. Those whose mutations or technologies offered tangible benefit to the emerging Imperium of man were spared and absorbed, their existence tolerated despite the ideological contradictions they introduced. Foremost among these were the navigator houses. Their unique mutation, a third eye capable of perceiving the tides of the warp, had been carefully cultivated through millennia of genetic manipulation. To the emperor of mankind, these aberrations represented both potential and peril, remnants of humanity's fragmented evolution during the age of strife, to be judged, harnessed, or destroyed in his pursuit of unity. The emperor of mankind's response to these divergent human offshoots revealed the ruthless pragmatism beneath his visionary ideals. For all his devotion to the concept of a unified and pure humanity, the emperor was guided not by dogma, but by necessity. Those whose mutations or technologies offered tangible benefit to the emerging Imperium of man were spared and absorbed, their existence tolerated despite the ideological contradictions they introduced. Foremost among these were the navigator houses. Their unique mutation, a third eye capable of perceiving the tides of the warp, had been carefully cultivated through millennia of genetic manipulation. To the emperor of mankind, these aberrations represented both potential and peril, remnants of humanity's fragmented evolution during the age of strife, to be judged, harnessed, or destroyed in his pursuit of unity. The emperor of mankind's response to these divergent human offshoots revealed the ruthless pragmatism beneath his visionary ideals. For all his devotion to the concept of a unified and pure humanity, the emperor was guided not by dogma, but by necessity. Those whose mutations or technologies offered tangible benefit to the emerging Imperium of man were spared and absorbed, their existence tolerated despite the ideological contradictions they introduced. Foremost among these were the navigator houses. Their unique mutation, a third eye capable of perceiving the tides of the warp, had been carefully cultivated through millennia of genetic manipulation. To the emperor of mankind, these aberrations represented both potential and peril, remnants of humanity's fragmented evolution during the age of strife, to be judged, harnessed, or destroyed in his pursuit of unity. The emperor of mankind's response to these divergent human offshoots revealed the ruthless pragmatism beneath his visionary ideals. For all his devotion to the concept of a unified and pure humanity, the emperor was guided not by dogma, but by necessity. Those whose mutations or technologies offered tangible benefit to the emerging Imperium of man were spared and absorbed, their existence tolerated despite the ideological contradictions they introduced. Foremost among these were the navigator houses. Their unique mutation, a third eye capable of perceiving the tides of the warp, had been carefully cultivated through millennia of genetic manipulation. To the emperor of mankind, these aberrations represented both potential and peril, remnants of humanity's fragmented evolution during the age of strife, to be judged,
harnessed, or destroyed in his pursuit of unity. The emperor of mankind's response to these divergent human offshoots revealed the ruthless pragmatism beneath his visionary ideals. For all his devotion to the concept of a unified and pure humanity, the emperor was guided not by dogma, but by necessity. Those whose mutations or technologies offered tangible benefit to the emerging Imperium of man were spared and absorbed, their existence tolerated despite the ideological contradictions they introduced. Foremost among these were the navigator houses. Their unique mutation, a third eye capable of perceiving the currents of the warp, made them indispensable for interstellar navigation. Recognizing their strategic value, the emperor granted them protected status and formal sanction, integrating them into the Imperium's growing structure. Though their existence defied the materialist doctrines that would later become the imperial truth, they became an essential pillar of the Great Crusade that would soon reach beyond Sol. The Mechanicum of Mars emerged as one of the Emperor's most crucial allies during the later stages of the Unification Wars. Its members, devoted to the cult Mechanicus, pursued what they saw as transcendence through the replacement of flesh with machine. To the Emperor, their obsession with cybernetic ascension and the Omnissiah bordered dangerously on religious worship, the very superstition he sought to eradicate elsewhere. Yet their mastery of technology and industry made them indispensable to his vision. Pragmatism prevailed over ideology, and Mars was brought into alliance with Terra, uniting the twin powers that would later form the heart of the Imperium of Man. But not all divergent factions were granted such tolerance. The Psychic Covens, whose uncontrolled powers tore rifts into the warp and drew the attention of predatory entities beyond human comprehension, found no mercy in the Emperor's design. They were systematically eradicated, their existence deemed too unstable and too dangerous to permit within the order he sought to build. The fate of those deemed too dangerous or unstable was absolute. Members of the outlawed Psyker Covens were either executed outright or subjected to the terrifying process of soul binding, their minds forcibly linked to the Emperor of Mankind's vast psychic presence. Through this metaphysical connection, their will was subsumed by his own, ensuring unwavering obedience. It was a practice that contradicted the materialist philosophy of the imperial truth, which would later deny that such supernatural mechanisms even existed. Likewise, the gene cults, radical sects whose self-inflicted modifications had driven them far from baseline humanity, were given a single, merciless choice: submit to genetic reconstruction or face annihilation. To the Emperor, unity demanded purity, and no deviation, however ancient or sacred, could be allowed to threaten the integrity of the species he intended to lead into the stars. Most of the gene cults rejected submission, choosing death over what they saw as the destruction of their sacred evolution. Their defiance only fueled the escalating brutality of the unification wars, as the Emperor of Mankind crushed every rival vision of humanity beneath his relentless advance. Amid this tide of conquest, the Emperor's inner circle began to take shape, a cadre of genetically perfected warriors and advisors who would become the foundation of his rule. Foremost among them was Constantine Valdor, the first and greatest of the Legio Custodes. Crafted through advanced genetic processes that predated even the creation of the Primarchs, Valdor embodied the Emperor's ideal: loyalty without question, strength without flaw, and purpose without end. Neither Primarch nor Astartes, Constantine Valdor occupied a singular place within the emerging imperial hierarchy. As commander of the Legio Custodes, he stood apart, the Emperor's personal guardian and enforcer, a being crafted with precision that surpassed all other genetic creations. His loyalty was not merely sworn, it was woven into his very biology, encoded at the cellular level and utterly immune to doubt or corruption. Valdor was more than a warrior. He was the living embodiment of the Emperor's will, the golden sentinel who stood eternal watch beside the master of mankind. Historical accounts portray Constantine Valdor as a being of unwavering purpose, a man who existed not as an individual, but as an extension of the Emperor's will. His every thought and action served a single objective: the preservation of the master of mankind. Where the Thunder Warriors, and later the Adeptus Astartes, were forged as instruments of conquest, Valdor was created as the shield, the immovable protector who stood between the Emperor and all possible harm. His devotion was absolute, his identity inseparable from the one he served. In Valdor, the Emperor's ideal of perfect obedience found its purest expression. The second figure to enter the Emperor's emerging inner circle embodied a different aspect of imperial power: Malcador the Sigillite, a psyker whose psychic might stood second only to the Emperor of Mankind, brought strategic brilliance and administrative mastery that balanced the purely martial focus of the unification wars. Older than most could imagine, even before the Emperor revealed his true nature, Malcador safeguarded fragments of humanity's lost golden age,
carrying forbidden wisdom through the long shadows of old night. His insight and diplomacy transformed the emperor's vision from a campaign of conquest into the foundation of a lasting imperium. Some accounts suggest that Malcador the Sigillite and the Emperor of Mankind shared a connection long before the Unification Wars began, perhaps one that spanned centuries, hidden within the secret history of Terra. Whispers among imperial archivists speak of a silent partnership that guided humanity from the shadows, preparing the way for the Emperor's revelation to the world. Others claim that Malcador the Sigillite was irresistibly drawn to the Emperor's psychic radiance, recognizing in it the only hope for humanity's survival amid a galaxy that had turned against its creators. United by purpose rather than faith, these three, the Emperor of Mankind, Constantine Valdor, and Malcador the Sigillite, became the triumvirate upon which the earliest foundations of the Imperium of Man were built. Their complementary strengths, the visionary, the guardian, and the administrator, formed a perfectly balanced triumvirate that offset each other's limitations. When the Emperor's boundless ambition risked outpacing the constraints of reality, Malcador the Sigillite offered wisdom and restraint. When threats arose that demanded decisive force, Constantine Valdor, the Emperor's unflinching hand, executed his will with precision and without hesitation. Together, they embodied the harmony of vision, discipline, and order that would define the early Imperium. This careful distribution of authority allowed the Emperor of Mankind to concentrate on the grand architecture of his design, leaving the intricacies of governance and execution to those who shared his vision, if not his divinity. Under this structure, the conquest of Terra advanced with cold precision. Rather than seeking total compliance through linear campaigns, the Emperor prioritized the reclamation of strategic nexuses, regions rich in resources, technology, or population, whose control would ensure the rapid collapse of lesser powers that surrounded them. The Indonesic bloc, once ruled by techno-tyrants who maintained absolute dominance through chemical conditioning and mass indoctrination, stood as one of the most formidable bastions against the Emperor's unification. Their defiance was foreseen, and the campaign against them executed with calculated precision. Through a devastating blend of overwhelming military power, strategic orbital strikes, and the systematic elimination of key leadership, the Emperor's forces dismantled their regime piece by piece, turning one of Terra's most oppressive empires into another stone laid in the foundation of the Imperium of Man. The surviving population, freed from generations of chemical enslavement, embraced the Emperor's cause with fervent devotion that bordered on worship. Their gratitude, born from liberation and awe, evolved into near-religious reverence, an emotional response the Emperor of Mankind neither encouraged nor forbade. Ever pragmatic, he recognized the psychological power of faith as a stabilizing force, using it to maintain order and unity throughout the fragile transition into imperial rule.
In the Nordafric conclaves, the Emperor faced a resistance unlike any other on Terra. These confederations of scholar kings had safeguarded remnants of humanity's lost scientific heritage, maintaining a fragile continuity of knowledge through the long darkness of old night. Their rediscovered technologies, though primitive when measured against the wonders of the Dark Age of technology, still possessed enough sophistication and destructive power to challenge even the Emperor's most formidable conventional forces. The Emperor of Mankind approached the Nordafric region with rare diplomacy, choosing persuasion over conquest. Rather than demanding immediate submission, he extended an offer of alliance and preservation to the scholar kings. Understanding the futility of resistance against the advancing imperial war machine and desiring to safeguard their ancient knowledge, the scholar kings accepted the Emperor's terms, thus ensuring both their survival and the continuation of their hard-won scientific legacy under the banner of the Imperium of Man.
The absorbed technologies of the Nord-Afric scholar kings were swiftly integrated into the imperial war machine, enhancing production efficiency, weapon lethality, and logistical coordination across the expanding domains of Terra. Empowered by these advancements, the Emperor turned his attention to the Pan-Pacific Empire, the most formidable obstacle to planetary unification. Its enigmatic ruler, known in fragmented records only as Nathan Doom, commanded the largest contiguous territory remaining on Old Earth. Through unmatched technological dominance and a regime of brutal internal discipline, Doom's empire stood as the final bastion of resistance against the Emperor's vision of a unified humanity. Intelligence gathered by Malkador's network of operatives revealed that Nathan Doom had unearthed fragments of standard template construction (STC) databases, technological relics from humanity's lost golden age. With these, he had forged weapons and war engines thought forever vanished in the long twilight of old night. The Emperor understood that the campaign against the Pan-Pacific Empire would demand unprecedented mobilization, resources, manpower, and strategic coordination, far surpassing any previous conquest. It threatened to delay the broader dream of global unification. It was during the meticulous preparations for this monumental campaign that the Emperor, for the first time, disclosed elements of his Primarch project to his inner circle. What had been until then a secret confined to his own laboratories and thoughts was now unveiled as the cornerstone of humanity's future, a plan to create beings who would transcend the limits of both man and machine. Beneath the vast and ancient Himalayan mountains, deep within laboratories sealed from physical detection and warp-based intrusion, the Emperor began his most ambitious creation. 20 transhuman beings of unparalleled genetic sophistication. These were no mere soldiers or scholars. They were living embodiments of his will, engineered to embody the finest aspects of humanity elevated beyond mortal constraint. Each Primarch was conceived through a synthesis of gene alchemy, psychic imprinting, and bioforging, guided by knowledge the Emperor alone retained from the dark age of technology. Their purpose was monumental, to serve as generals, philosophers, and demigods who would lead mankind's armies across the stars and forge a unified Imperium of man that would endure for millennia. These transhuman creations, whom the Emperor named the Primarchs, were destined to become both the supreme generals of his legions and the living extensions of his divine authority. Each Primarch embodied a distinct fragment of the Emperor's vast and multifaceted genius, courage, wisdom, ambition, strategy, or faith distilled into physical and psychic perfection. Through the Primarchs, the Emperor sought to project his will across the stars, establishing a galactic hierarchy with himself as the unifying apex. Under his rule, humanity would at last find order, security, and purpose, freed from the anarchy of old night and guided toward the golden future he envisioned for all mankind. The Primarch project stood as the pinnacle of human genetic engineering, surpassing even the creation of the Thunder Warriors and the Custodian Guard in both scale and sophistication. Conceived within the hidden vaults of the Emperor's Himalayan laboratories, it represented the greatest scientific and psychic undertaking in human history. Each Primarch was meticulously crafted to serve a unique purpose within the Emperor's grand design for galactic unification. Their genetic blueprints were individually tailored, some embodying unshakable loyalty, others tactical brilliance, creative genius, or indomitable will. Together, they would form the living foundation of the Imperium's future, bridging the gap between godlike power and human potential. Each Primarch was engineered with a distinct purpose, reflecting a facet of the Emperor's vast strategic vision. Some were optimized for void warfare, commanding fleets that would bring the stars themselves under Imperial control.
Others were crafted for planetary conquest, leading ground campaigns with unmatched precision and ferocity. A few were gifted with extraordinary diplomatic acumen, capable of securing compliance through persuasion and charisma rather than bloodshed. Yet when diplomacy failed, other Primarchs embodied the unyielding force and martial supremacy needed to crush resistance completely. Together, they represented the perfect synthesis of war, governance, and destiny, humanity's ultimate instruments of galactic unification. Together, the Primarchs would form a transhuman command structure, a brotherhood of demigods capable of waging war and governance across thousands of light years. They were designed to lead the Great Crusade, reuniting the countless lost colonies of mankind under the unifying doctrine of the Imperial truth. As these godlike beings gestated within their secure incubation chambers, hidden deep beneath the Himalayan mountains, the Emperor of Mankind pressed onward with the final stages of Terra's unification. Through armies of mortals, thunder warriors, and newly forged institutions, he continued to conquer the last techno-barbarian states, laying the foundation for the Imperium that would soon stretch to the stars. The Thunder Warriors, for all their genetic instability and psychological volatility, remained the Emperor's most lethal weapon during the final phase of Terra's unification wars. Engineered for a single purpose, total annihilation of resistance, these towering warriors shattered the last techno-barbarian enclaves with unstoppable brutality. Contemporary records describe battlefields reduced to carnal plains, where entire armies were erased within hours. The Thunder Warriors themselves suffered catastrophic losses, yet their relentless advance never faltered. Driven by programmed loyalty and unmatched ferocity, they embodied the terrible efficiency of the Emperor's vision: humanity reforged through fire and blood.
The Emperor's final victories on Terra were not the result of tactical subtlety, but of overwhelming brute force warfare. The Thunder Warriors crushed their enemies through sheer power and endurance, yet this strategy came at a terrible cost. Each campaign consumed vast resources and countless lives, rendering the approach unsustainable for the galactic ambitions that lay ahead. Recognizing both the strengths and fatal flaws of his first creations, the Emperor of Mankind began work on their successors, a new breed of warriors who would combine the discipline of mortals with the might of demigods. From this vision would arise the Legiones Astartes, the Space Marines, the true instruments through which the Emperor would carry his light to the stars. The Legiones Astartes, or Space Marines, represented the next evolutionary step in the Emperor's quest to forge the ultimate warriors. Built upon the genetic foundation of the Thunder Warriors, they incorporated refinements to the gene seed implantation process, resulting in far greater biological stability, endurance, and lifespan. Unlike their predecessors, engineered solely for the brutal wars of Terra, the Space Marines were designed for universal adaptability. They could fight and thrive in any environment, from airless moons and frozen wastelands to toxic death worlds and the void of space itself. Each Astartes became a living weapon of the Imperium, capable of waging war wherever humanity's destiny demanded. The Space Marines were more than just refined warriors, they were perfected instruments of will. Their psychological conditioning emphasized unyielding discipline, loyalty, and tactical precision over the uncontrolled berserker fury that had defined the Thunder Warriors. This balance made them ideally suited for the complex compliance campaigns that would shape the coming Great Crusade, where conquest required both force and control. But as the Emperor's preparations for the Pan-Pacific campaign neared completion, disaster struck at the very core of his grand design. Deep within the hidden laboratories beneath the Himalayan mountains, the Primarch project, his most sacred and ambitious creation, was violently disrupted. The Primarch project, the cornerstone of the Emperor's grand vision for humanity's ascension, was suddenly and catastrophically compromised. The exact cause of this disaster remains shrouded in mystery, its truth buried within the most restricted Imperial archives. Some claim warp-born entities infiltrated the Emperor's laboratories. Others whisper of sabotage from within. Whatever the mechanism, be it psychic interference, technological failure, or chaotic corruption, the result was devastating. The 20 incubation pods, each containing a gestating Primarch, were violently cast into the Imperium. Torn from the Emperor's control, they were scattered across the galaxy, flung to distant worlds far beyond his immediate reach. What had been designed as the greatest triumph of human science and will became, in a moment, a tragedy that reshaped galactic destiny. In a single devastating instant, the carefully constructed succession that the Emperor of Mankind had designed was shattered beyond repair. The loss of the Primarchs, the very foundation of his plan for humanity's future, threw the entire project into chaos. For perhaps the first and only time in recorded history, the Emperor's composure faltered. Those present within the Himalayan laboratories bore witness to a storm of psychic fury unlike anything humanity had ever experienced. His rage unleashed waves of psychic energy so immense that instruments exploded, containment fields collapsed, and entire systems within the facility overloaded and burned out. In that moment, even his closest aides understood. The Emperor's wrath was not merely human anger, it was the fury of a god denied his design. For a fleeting moment, the master of mankind seemed stripped of his divine detachment. The calculated visionary who had forged empires and broken kings appeared instead as a father bereft of his children, his fury tempered by a grief that even his immense will could not entirely conceal. Witnesses to that moment would later speak of it in hushed tones, a rare glimpse of humanity beneath the Emperor's golden facade, a vulnerability that would seldom be seen again across the long millennia of war and conquest that followed. When the initial shock subsided, the Emperor's legendary pragmatism once more took command. Though the Primarch project had been catastrophically disrupted, it was not beyond recovery. The genetic templates of the lost Primarchs still existed, safeguarded within the Emperor's laboratories beneath the Himalayas. From these priceless sequences, the Emperor engineered the Legiones Astartes, the Space Marine legions, each born from the genetic legacy of a lost Primarch. Through this breakthrough, humanity's greatest general ensured that even in loss, his design for a unified Imperium would endure and evolve, paving the way for the Great Crusade that would soon reshape the galaxy. From the recovered genetic material of the lost Primarchs, 20 Space Marine legions were created, each a reflection of its absent progenitor's unique genetic essence. Though none could match the sheer power or charisma of the Primarchs themselves, these Astartes warriors embodied a new evolution of humanity's potential. Engineered for strength, endurance, and unwavering loyalty, the Legiones Astartes possessed enhanced bodies, sharpened minds, and lifespans far beyond ordinary men. Once the unification of Terra was complete, these transhuman soldiers would become the vanguard of the Great Crusade, leading the Emperor's armies to reclaim the scattered worlds of man and forge the Imperium of man across the stars. In response to the catastrophic loss of the Primarchs, the Emperor of Mankind ordered the accelerated development of the First Legion, the Dark Angels. He recognized that the timeline for galactic unification would have to be recalibrated, with new strategic priorities set in place. Immediate focus shifted towards mastering void warfare and securing the Sol system, ensuring the Imperium's cradle would be fully under his control before any expansion into the wider galaxy. Even as these preparations continued, the Pan-Pacific campaign pressed forward. Despite the loss of his greatest genetic creations, the Emperor refused to delay. The conquest of the Pan-Pacific Empire became both a demonstration of imperial resilience and a testbed for the emerging Astartes legions, a war that would forge the foundations of the Imperium's future military might.
The Pan-Pacific campaign opened with the Thunder Warrior cohorts leading the brutal vanguard, bearing the full weight of the initial assault against Nathan Doom's empire. Supporting them were the first experimental Space Marine units, deployed to test their effectiveness under true war conditions. The conflict's scale and savagery surpassed even the bloodiest battles of the earlier unification wars, transforming vast territories into irradiated wastelands. Both factions unleashed weapons of mass destruction, reshaping Terra's already devastated landscape. Nathan Doom's forces employed chemical and biological agents so virulent that entire regions were rendered permanently uninhabitable. The Emperor's armies responded with overwhelming force, their victory measured not in territory gained, but in the annihilation of resistance itself, each step bringing humanity closer to its final unification under the Imperium of Man. Once the Selenar gene coats of Luna had been subdued and their powerful orbital weapon platforms repurposed for Imperial command, the Emperor of Mankind unleashed the full might of his forces upon the Pan-Pacific Empire. The Imperial response was swift and absolute. Precision orbital strikes devastated enemy strongholds, annihilating resistance with surgical efficiency. The Pan-Pacific campaign would ultimately stand as a grim testament to the unstoppable will of the Emperor during the final phase of the Unification Wars, a moment when his divine focus converged entirely upon a single purpose: the total unification of Terra under the Imperium of Man. The Nathan Doom's final bastion, a colossal hive fortress built using remnants of humanity's most advanced architectural eras, was obliterated beneath the fury of orbital bombardment, its once towering spires reduced to nothing more than radioactive slag. This decisive strike marked the end of the Pan-Pacific Empire and cemented the Emperor of Mankind's dominance over Terra during the closing days of the Unification Wars. In the aftermath of the Pan-Pacific Empire's annihilation, surviving citizens were absorbed into the growing imperial infrastructure according to their abilities and the extent of their loyalty or guilt under the fallen regime. The Emperor's savants meticulously recovered what knowledge and technology had survived the devastation, cataloging every fragment for immediate integration or preservation within the Mechanicum's vaults for future use. With the collapse of the Pan-Pacific Empire, the last major bastion of organized resistance on Terra was broken, marking a decisive milestone in the Emperor of Mankind's Unification Wars and the birth of a truly united Imperium. What remained of resistance on Terra were scattered enclaves, isolated strongholds whose survival owed more to geography than power. As the Unification Wars neared their inevitable end, the Emperor of Mankind turned his attention to the next stage of his grand design, the forging of the Treaty of Mars. The Mechanicum of Mars, long an independent power throughout the Age of Strife, stood as both a potential ally and a formidable obstacle. Their vast knowledge of technology and ancient machine lore presented an unparalleled opportunity, but one that required careful negotiation to avoid plunging humanity's fragile unity back into conflict. The Mechanicum's mastery of technology and unparalleled industrial might made them indispensable to the Emperor's vision of a unified galaxy. Their forges and arcane knowledge would fuel the Great Crusade, producing the warships, armor, and weapons needed to reclaim humanity's lost worlds. Yet their devotion to the machine god stood in contradiction to the imperial truth, the Emperor's doctrine of secular rationality. Recognizing the necessity of alliance over ideology, the Emperor demonstrated his characteristic pragmatism. Through careful negotiation, he forged the historic Treaty of Mars, a pact that granted the Mechanicum autonomy over its internal affairs in exchange for unwavering material support to the Imperium. It was one of the Emperor's most significant compromises, ensuring both unity and progress at the dawn of the Imperium's rise. By permitting the Mechanicum's worship of the Omnicia and allowing them to identify the Emperor with their machine god, a calculated paradox was born at the heart of the Imperium. In doing so, the Emperor granted a sanctioned exception to the imperial truth, the very doctrine that condemned all forms of religious faith. This pragmatic compromise, essential for securing the Mechanicum's alliance and technological support, introduced a fatal contradiction into the Imperial's ideological foundation. Though justified by necessity, this tolerance of mechanical divinity would later seed the philosophical and spiritual fractures that eroded the coherence of the imperial truth itself, foreshadowing the divisions that would one day tear humanity apart.
For the moment, the Treaty of Mars proved invaluable to the newborn Imperium. The alliance granted the Emperor direct access to Mars's legendary forge complexes and the technological mastery of the Mechanicum, enabling the mass production of war gear, starships, and armor for the rapidly expanding Legiones Astartes. With the Red Planet secured through diplomacy, and the last remnants of Terran resistance confined to scattered enclaves, the Emperor turned his gaze to the final campaign of the Unification Wars, the Battle of Mount Ararat. It would be here, upon that blood-soaked mountain, that the dream of a unified Terra would at last be realized beneath the Emperor's golden banner. The Battle of Mount Ararat was proclaimed to the Thunder Warriors as their ultimate triumph, the final campaign that would secure Terra's unification and fulfill the Emperor's imperial vision. Yet beneath this promise of glory lay a hidden purpose, one known only to the Emperor and his closest advisors. Though the Thunder Warriors believed they fought their final battle in the Emperor's name, the Battle of Mount Ararat was engineered as their silent execution. Each unit was deployed into positions ensuring their systematic elimination at the hands of the first fully operational Space Marine legions. Official Imperial records immortalized the Thunder Warriors as fallen heroes of the Unification Wars, martyrs to humanity's rebirth. Yet the hidden truth, that they were purged to erase genetic instability and make way for the Emperor of mankind's next creation, remained buried within the highest circles of Imperial command. This calculated ruthlessness exposed the fundamental nature of the Emperor of mankind's methodology. Every action, no matter how merciless, served the singular purpose of securing humanity's survival. Compassion, sentiment, or individual loyalty held no place within his grand design. The Unification Wars were not merely battles for dominance, they were the crucible in which the foundations of the Imperium of Man were forged, through blood, precision, and the Emperor's unyielding will. The Emperor of mankind's vision for humanity's future allowed no instability or distraction to endure once its purpose had been fulfilled. The Thunder Warriors, who had been the brutal instruments of Terra's unification, had now outlived their usefulness. Their genetic flaws and psychological volatility made them both unsustainable and dangerous within the emerging Imperium of Man. Their quiet extermination, justified by necessity, revealed the cold strategic calculus that lay beneath the Emperor's aura of divine benevolence, an unwavering commitment to order even at the cost of his first creations. For the Emperor of mankind, the preservation of humanity would not come through compassion or sentiment, but through the cold logic of survival and collective necessity. With Terra unified under his absolute rule and Mars bound in alliance through the Treaty of Mars, the Emperor turned toward his next grand design, the reconquest of humanity's lost worlds scattered across the stars. To prepare for this monumental endeavor, the orbital shipyards of Luna were expanded to a scale unseen since the Dark Age of technology, forming the foundation of the Great Crusade that would soon reshape the galaxy. The newly constructed Imperial shipyards of Luna began producing vast fleets of vessels engineered for both warfare and colonization, marking the dawn of the Great Crusade. Across the red forges of Mars, the Mechanicum labored at full capacity to arm the rapidly expanding Legiones Astartes, crafting weapons and armor worthy of the Emperor's chosen warriors. On Terra, the first Imperial army regiments were raised from the most compliant and loyal regions, destined to serve alongside the Space Marines and the Emperor's wars of reconquest. To guide these fleets through the turbulent currents of the warp, the Emperor gathered navigators from the ancient houses that had preserved their unique mutation, the legendary Third Eye, essential for safe passage beyond the Sol system and into the stars. During this crucial phase of preparation for the Great Crusade, the Emperor of mankind shifted his focus from military conquest
position invested with responsibility for the Great Crusade's success, but lacking the absolute authority the Emperor had wielded. This tension between responsibility and authority became further complicated by the Emperor's creation of the Council of Terra, a governing body comprised of mortal administrators rather than primarchs. This institutional restructuring, intended to establish sustainable civil governance for the expanding Imperium, was interpreted by many primarchs as diminishment of their authority. The Emperor, perceiving time differently through his immortal perspective, failed to appreciate how this reorganization would appear to beings who, despite their enhanced nature, still experienced emotions through a fundamentally human lens. What seemed to him a logical evolution of imperial administration registered to them as personal rejection. The Edict of Nicaea further exacerbated these tensions. convened to address the growing controversy surrounding psychic powers within the Legiones Astartes. This conclave resulted in severe restrictions on such abilities, a devastating blow to legions like the Thousand Sons, whose tactical doctrine incorporated warp-based techniques. The Emperor's decree, delivered without the context of his deeper understanding of the Imperium's dangers, appeared arbitrary and punitive to those affected. Magnus the Red, Primarch of the Thousand Sons, and himself the most powerful psyker among the Emperor's sons, perceived this edict as not merely strategic restriction, but personal repudiation. These accumulating grievances created fertile ground for the corruption that would eventually tear the Imperium asunder. The entities that had scattered the infant Primarchs millennia earlier had not abandoned their interest in the Emperor's creations. Through subtle influence that bypassed even transhuman perception, they worked to amplify existing resentments and ambitions. The Emperor, focused on his Webway project, and perhaps overconfident in the loyalty engineered into his sons, remained blind to these manipulations until they had progressed beyond containment. The stage was thus prepared for the greatest tragedy in human history. The Great Crusade continued its outward expansion, bringing new worlds into compliance with increasing efficiency under Horus's strategic direction. The administrative foundations established by the Council of Terra gradually evolved into the bureaucratic structures that would eventually manage the Imperium's vast territories. And beneath the surface of this apparent progress, currents of discontent and corruption gathered strength, preparing to erupt in a civil conflict that would bring the Emperor's dream of unified humanity to the brink of destruction. Yet before this gathering storm broke, the Great Crusade achieved its zenith, a period of unprecedented expansion and triumph. With all 20 Primarchs recovered and integrated into Imperial command, the pace of conquest accelerated beyond even the most optimistic projections. The final decade of the Crusade's ascendant phase witnessed the compliance of more worlds than the previous 30 years combined. This exponential growth testified to both the brilliance of the Emperor's design and the tragic timing of its subversion. The Imperium was brought to the cusp of complete victory before being torn apart from within. The Primarchs, despite their growing grievances with distant Terra, demonstrated martial brilliance that justified their creation. Lionel Johnson of the Dark Angels prosecuted campaigns of such perfect strategic execution that even his brother Primarchs studied them with admiration. Reboot Gilliman's methodical expansion of Ultramar created a model for post-compliance governance that would later serve as template for the Imperium's reconstruction after Civil War. Ferrus Manus of the Iron Hands pushed the boundaries of Imperial technology, collaborating with the Mechanicum to develop weapons that could overcome any conceivable resistance. Each Primarch, in his specialized domain, approached a perfection of function that vindicated the Emperor's genetic artistry. Their legions evolved in parallel, developing combat doctrines of increasing sophistication as experience accumulated. The Alpha Legion perfected infiltration techniques that allowed bloodless compliance through targeted removal of resistant leadership. The Blood Angels refined assault protocols that utilized their Primarch's genetic gift for aerial combat, descending upon targets with terrible beauty that paralyzed defenders with awe before annihilation. The Death Guard developed resilience against environmental hazards that allowed them to prosecute campaigns on worlds where even standard Astartes physiology would have faltered. These specializations transformed the Space Marine legions from mere military units into unique institutions, each carrying distinct traditions and methodologies beneath the common purpose of imperial expansion. During this period, the various legions' size and composition underwent significant evolution. Some, like the Ultramarines, expanded dramatically as their Primarchs emphasized recruitment and training. Others maintained smaller numbers but increased individual capability through specialized equipment or tactical innovation. This diversity of approach reflected the autonomy granted to the Primarchs in implementing the Emperor's broader vision. They shared common purpose, but employed vastly different methods in its pursuit. This operational freedom, while maximizing each legion's effectiveness within its specialty, created disparities in influence that contributed to the interpersonal dynamics later exploited by corrupting forces. The human worlds brought into compliance during this period experienced integration processes of varying gentleness. Those that submitted willingly received technological uplift, administrative guidance, and security guarantees with minimal disruption to existing social structures. Those requiring military conquest faced more comprehensive reconstruction, with imperial truth replacing local belief systems and imperial administration supplanting indigenous governance. This graduated response reflected practical resource allocation rather than ethical consideration. Worlds that could contribute to the Imperium with minimal investment received preferential treatment compared to those requiring substantial reconstruction before becoming productive components of the whole. As the Great Crusade reached distant regions of the galaxy, it encountered human civilizations that had evolved in isolation for millennia, developing cultures unrecognizable to Terran standards. Some had achieved technological advancement that rivaled or exceeded imperial capabilities in specialized domains. Others had regressed to pre-industrial conditions, their populations unaware that humanity had once traveled between stars. The Imperium's approach to these diverse societies revealed an underlying philosophy that transcended mere conquest. The Emperor's vision encompassed not just territorial unification but cultural standardization. Human diversity, which had flourished during Old Knight's isolation, was systematically replaced with imperial uniformity, erasing countless unique adaptations in service to a singular conception of humanity's proper form. This homogenization extended beyond culture into biology itself. Human populations that had adapted to extreme environments through natural selection or deliberate modification were evaluated against imperial baseline standards. Those whose divergence exceeded acceptable parameters faced either genetic normalization or, in extreme cases, designation as subhuman, a classification that carried significant social and legal restrictions. This taxonomic approach to human diversity reflected the Emperor's vision of humanity as a species with defined boundaries rather than an evolving continuum. The irony that this policy was implemented by transhuman beings, who themselves represented radical departure from the human baseline, appears to have escaped contemporary observers. Throughout this period of expansion, the Emperor remained sequestered within the imperial palace, his attention focused on projects invisible to all but his closest confidants. Occasional communications emerged from this seclusion, providing strategic direction or resolving disputes that had escalated beyond Horus's authority. These interventions decreased in frequency as the Webway project consumed more of the Emperor's concentration, creating the impression of increasing detachment from the empire he had initiated. Whether this withdrawal represented necessary focus on existential concerns or dangerous neglect of immediate governance remains debated by imperial scholars, though such debates occur only in the most secure environments, beyond the hearing of those who might consider them heretical. The War Master, for his part, attempted to fill the void created by the Emperor's absence. Horus combined military genius with personal charisma in a manner that inspired loyalty throughout the imperial hierarchy. His diplomatic skill smoothed tensions between competing primarchs, while his strategic vision maintained the Crusade's momentum despite increasing complexity of operations. Yet even these considerable abilities proved insufficient for the burden placed upon them. Coordinating the activities of 18 transhuman brothers, each with the ego appropriate to his demigod status, stretched Horus's capacity for mediation to its limits. The absence of the Emperor's overwhelming authority became increasingly problematic as the Primarchs pursued individual agendas beneath the veneer of unified purpose. This period also witnessed the growth of institutions that would eventually outlast the Great Crusade itself. The Mechanicum, having expanded beyond Mars through the establishment of forge worlds throughout compliant territory, developed increasing autonomy from Terran oversight. The Navis Nobilite, comprised of navigator houses essential for warp travel, secured privileges that placed them partially outside standard imperial authority. The various branches of the Administratum evolved specialized functions that eventually crystallized into separate departments with distinct traditions and priorities. These parallel hierarchies, while necessary for managing an empire of unprecedented scale, created administrative complexity that sometimes impeded rather than facilitated imperial function. Most significant among these developing institutions was the Legiones Astartes itself. Originally conceived as instruments of conquest that would eventually be superseded by conventional governance, the Space Marine legions had become entities whose power transcended mere military function. Each legion maintained recruitment operations, training facilities, fleet assets, and support personnel that collectively represented a self-sufficient organization capable of independent operation. The Primarchs, intended as generals within a unified command structure, had evolved into what resembled sovereign rulers of transhuman kingdoms bound by nominal allegiance to distant terror. This evolution, unforeseen in the Emperor's original design, created political realities that contributed to the subsequent fragmentation of imperial unity. As the Great Crusade approached what would later be recognized as its final phase, signs of the coming conflagration manifested in isolated incidents across the expanding Imperium. Compliance actions that had previously proceeded with clinical efficiency began to exhibit concerning deviations from established protocol. The World Eaters under Angron displayed increasing brutality that exceeded tactical necessity. The Night Lords employed terror tactics that appeared motivated by sadistic pleasure rather than strategic calculation. The Word-Bearers, having received devastating censure for their earlier religious practices, prosecuted compliance with a fervor that bordered on the fanatical while maintaining outward adherence to the imperial truth. These anomalies, reported through command channels but often mitigated in transmission, failed to trigger intervention before malignant patterns became established. Simultaneously, warp disturbances began to increase in frequency and intensity across multiple sectors, disrupting navigation and communication. These phenomena, dismissed by most imperial authorities as natural fluctuations in the immaterium, represented warning signs visible only to those with specialized knowledge of warp mechanics, knowledge deliberately restricted by the Emperor's policy of controlled information. The librarians of the Thousand Suns, despite the restrictions imposed by the Edict of Nicaea, recorded these disturbances with growing concern, but found their warnings dismissed as special pleading by a legion seeking to overturn the Emperor's decree. This intersection of institutional blindness and deliberate ignorance created perfect conditions for the catastrophe to come. Thus, the Great Crusade reached its apex, an empire spanning a significant portion of the galaxy, administered through institutions of unprecedented complexity, defended by warriors of superhuman capability, and guided by transhuman generals of godlike power. To mortal observers, the Imperium appeared as the inevitable fulfillment of humanity's destiny, a machine of conquest and compliance so perfectly designed that nothing could prevent its eventual domination of all human-inhabited space. What remained hidden beneath this edifice of apparent invincibility were the fracture lines that had developed during its construction, philosophical differences between Primarchs, resentments regarding the Emperor's withdrawal, and the subtle corruption that had taken root in multiple legions. The stage was thus prepared for the greatest tragedy in human history, a civil conflict that would bring the Emperor's dream of unified humanity to the brink of destruction. Yet before darkness descended, the Great Crusade achieved heights of glory that would be remembered through distorted legend for millennia to come. For a brief, luminous moment, humanity stood united beneath the imperial aquila, reaching toward a future of unlimited potential. That this moment ended in fratricidal bloodshed rather than transcendent evolution remains the defining tragedy of human history, a fall from grace that shaped all subsequent developments in the species' long, twilight struggle for survival in a hostile universe. The imperial palace stood silent beneath Terra's poisoned skies, its vast chambers empty save for the echo of forgotten footsteps. The Emperor had withdrawn into its deepest vaults, his presence a void more telling than any proclamation. Where once he had walked among his generals with golden purpose, Now only whispers remained, rumors of secret projects and arcane obsessions that consumed his attention while an empire strained at its seams. The custodian guard maintained their eternal vigilance outside sealed chambers, witnessing only occasional glimpses of their master as he passed between laboratories whose purpose remained unknown even to his closest advisors. The Imperial Webway project consumed the Emperor's focus with singular intensity. Deep beneath the palace foundations, in chambers shielded from both physical and psychic observation, he labored to create what would have been mankind's greatest achievement, a network of dimensional corridors allowing instantaneous travel between worlds without exposure to the warp's predatory currents. The ancient Aeldari had mastered this technology at the height of their dominion, creating pathways through reality's underlying structure that bypassed the Immaterium entirely. The Emperor sought to adapt these passages for human use, believing they represented humanity's only viable path to lasting galactic dominion. This work required concentration beyond mortal comprehension. The Emperor's vast psychic might focused on maintaining breaches in reality, while simultaneously preventing warp entities from exploiting those same openings. Each session depleted even his immense reserves, necessitating periods of recovery that further removed him from Imperial governance. Malcador the Sigillite, serving as regent in his absence, found himself issuing directives based on increasingly infrequent and cryptic instructions. The administrative apparatus of the Imperium continued functioning through institutional momentum rather than active guidance, its various branches developing autonomous practices that sometimes contradicted original intent. The Emperor's withdrawal might have been sustainable had the Great Crusade continued under unified leadership. But fractures had appeared in the command structure even before his return to Terra. The appointment of Horus as War Master, while logistically sensible, created hierarchical tensions among beings created to lead rather than follow. Some Primarchs accepted this reorganization with grudging pragmatism. Others perceived it as evidence of favoritism that contradicted the Emperor's supposed impartiality. These resentments, initially contained by shared purpose, began festering once the unifying presence of the Emperor was removed from direct oversight. Horus himself experienced mounting frustration as he attempted to coordinate the activities of his brother Primarchs, each a transhuman demigod, accustomed to autonomy within his assigned theater of operations. Some, like Robut Guilliman of the Ultramarines, maintained efficient compliance with strategic directives while clearly pursuing independent agendas within their assigned sectors. Others, like Angron of the World Eaters or Conrad Kurz of the Night Lords, required constant supervision to prevent their more destructive tendencies from undermining the Crusade's broader objectives. The War Master found himself occupying an impossible position invested with responsibility for the Great Crusade's success, but lacking the absolute authority the Emperor had wielded. This tension between responsibility and authority became further complicated by the Emperor's creation of the Council of Terra, a governing body comprised of mortal administrators rather than Primarchs. This institutional restructuring, intended to establish sustainable civil governance for the expanding Imperium, was interpreted by many Primarchs as diminishment of their authority. Military conquest, which had defined their existence since rediscovery, would eventually give way to bureaucratic administration in which they held no formal position. The Emperor, perceiving time differently through his immortal perspective, failed to appreciate how this reorganization would appear to beings who, despite their enhanced nature, still experienced emotions through a fundamentally human lens. What seemed to him a logical evolution of imperial administration registered to them as personal rejection. Most damaging among these institutional changes were the introduction of imperial tithe, a formalized system of resource extraction from compliant worlds to sustain further expansion. Planets that had been brought into the Imperium through the direct intervention of specific legions now found themselves answerable to civilian administrators with whom they had no personal connection. Primarchs, who had promised certain considerations to worlds that had surrendered peacefully, found these agreements overridden by distant bureaucrats following standardized protocols. These contradictions between battlefield promises and administrative reality created friction that undermined compliance in multiple sectors, requiring punitive expeditions that consumed military resources better applied to new conquests. The emperor's decree at the Council of Nicaea represented perhaps the most significant miscalculation of this period. Convened to address the growing controversy surrounding psychic powers within the Legiones Astartes, this conclave resulted in severe restrictions on such abilities, a devastating blow to legions like the Thousand Sons, whose tactical doctrine incorporated warp-based techniques. The emperor's ruling, delivered without the context of his deeper understanding of the Immaterium's dangers, appeared arbitrary and punitive to those affected. Magnus the Red, Primarch of the Thousand Sons, and himself the most powerful psyker among the emperor's sons, perceived this edict as not merely strategic restriction, but personal repudiation. This judgment carried particular sting given the apparent hypocrisy it represented. The emperor, the most powerful psyker humanity, had produced prohibited abilities he himself employed without restriction. The Sisters of Silence and the Legio Custodes continued utilizing specialized anti-psyker and warp-based technologies developed under his direct supervision, while Legion librarians were forced to suppress talents that had previously earned commendation. This contradiction between the emperor's words and actions created cognitive dissonance that corroded faith in his infallibility. If the master of mankind could be wrong about matters directly within his expertise, what other errors might lie buried within his grand design? These accumulating grievances created fertile ground for the corruption that would eventually tear the Imperium asunder. The entities that had scattered the infant Primarchs millennia earlier had not abandoned their interest in the Emperor's creations. Through subtle influence that bypassed even transhuman perception, they worked to amplify existing resentments and ambitions. The Emperor, focused on his Webway project and perhaps overconfident in the loyalty engineered into his sons, remained blind to these manipulations until they had progressed beyond containment. Among the Primarchs, Lorgar Aurelian of the Wordbearers had experienced the Emperor's censure most directly. His legion, having implemented worship of the Emperor as divine being on all worlds they brought to compliance, received unprecedented public rebuke for contradicting the imperial truth. The Emperor ordered the destruction of Lorgar's crowning achievement, the city of Monarchia, where the Primarch had raised temples celebrating the master of mankind as humanity's god. The Ultramarines carried out this demolition while the Wordbearers were forced to kneel in the ruins, their pride shattered along with their creation. This humiliation, delivered without private explanation or opportunity for redemption, transformed Lorgar's devotion into smoldering resentment and eventually active search for alternative objects of worship. This quest led the Wordbearers to the Cadia system, where ancient structures suggested previous contact between humanity and non-human intelligences. In the silence of these ruins, Lorgar received visions that claimed to reveal truths the Emperor had deliberately concealed: the existence of entities within the Immaterium that represented mankind's true divine heritage. These beings, which had guided human evolution since its earliest stages, offered Lorgar recognition that the Emperor had denied him. They named themselves the Primordial Truth, claiming to represent fundamental aspects of existence that transcended the Emperor's materialist limitations. Through their emissary Ingathel, they offered Lorgar not merely acceptance but exaltation, the opportunity to lead humanity toward its true destiny rather than the Emperor's flawed vision. Erebus and Cor Phaeron, Lorgar's most trusted advisors within the Wordbearers, encouraged exploration of these alternative teachings. Having never fully embraced the imperial truth themselves, they recognized opportunity in their Primarch's disillusionment. Under their guidance, Lorgar authorized expeditions into regions of space where the barrier between Materium and Immaterium had grown thin, allowing direct communion with the entities that had contacted him on Cadia. These pilgrimages, conducted in absolute secrecy from imperial oversight, resulted in revelations that transformed the fundamental nature of the Seventh Legion. Where once they had worshipped the Emperor with fanatical devotion, they now transferred that same intensity to new masters whose promises aligned more closely with their psychological needs. This corruption spread outward from the Wordbearers through carefully orchestrated interactions with other legions. Joint compliance actions became opportunities to identify individuals susceptible to alternative philosophies. Chaplains exchanged between legions for cultural enrichment carried subtle doctrinal modifications disguised as traditional wisdom. Lodge systems, modeled after Chthonian warrior fraternities and promoted as means of transcending rigid military hierarchy, provided perfect cover for initiatory structures that gradually introduced concepts contrary to the imperial truth. These vectors of corruption operated with such subtlety that even the most loyal primarchs failed to recognize the ideological contagion spreading through their ranks. Magnus the Red, isolated on Prospero following the Edict of Nicaea, pursued his own path toward catastrophe. The Emperor's prohibition of psychic practices had not diminished the Crimson King's abilities or curiosity, merely driven them underground. In secret chambers beneath Tizca's gleaming spires, he continued exploration of the Imperium's mysteries, convinced that his superior understanding would prevent the dangers the Emperor had cited as justification for the ban. This arrogance led him to techniques of increasing power and corresponding risk, pushing boundaries that existed for reasons beyond his comprehension. When his psychic explorations revealed a plot against the Imperium forming among his brother primarchs, Magnus attempted to warn the Emperor through methods explicitly forbidden by the Nicaea decree. This desperate communication breached psychic wards the Emperor had established around the Imperial Palace to protect the Webway project from warp predation. Magnus's uncontrolled power tore through these defenses like parchment, creating a rupture that allowed entities from the Imperium direct access to the partially completed human sections of the Webway. The Emperor was forced to take direct action, personally containing the breach through constant application of his psychic might, an imprisonment that would continue uninterrupted until the final confrontation with Horus. This catastrophic failure of the Webway project represented not merely tactical setback, but fundamental compromise of humanity's intended evolutionary path, forcing continued reliance on warp travel with all its attendant risks. The Emperor's rage at this interference manifested in a punitive expedition dispatched to Prospero, with Leman Russ of the Space Wolves assigned executioner's duties. Whether the Emperor intended censure or annihilation remains. Debated communication errors exacerbated by warp disturbances resulted in a campaign of extermination rather than arrest. The burning of Prospero eliminated an entire legion's worth of potential loyalist Astartes, while simultaneously driving Magnus directly into the arms of those conspiring against the Imperium. This tragedy of errors, born from the Emperor's growing isolation and failure to maintain clear communication channels with his sons, exemplified the systemic breakdowns occurring throughout the Imperial command structure. While these events unfolded across the expanding Imperium, the pivot point of betrayal took shape in a seemingly routine compliance action in the Davin system. Horus, leading his lunar wolves against a rebellious planetary governor who had previously submitted to Imperial authority, sustained a wound from an anatheme blade, a weapon whose true nature transcended its physical form. This injury, resistant to Astartes' healing capabilities, provided opportunity for the same entities that had corrupted Lorgar to access the Warmaster's consciousness directly. During his medical isolation, Horus experienced what appeared to be prophetic visions, showing the Emperor's supposed true intentions godhood achieved through sacrifice of his sons, with humanity enslaved rather than elevated. These visions, carefully crafted to exploit Horus's existing concerns regarding the Emperor's withdrawal and the creation of civilian governance structures, presented corruption as tragic necessity. By the time the War Master emerged from his healing trance, fundamental aspects of his personality had been inverted, his loyalty to the Emperor replaced by determination to prevent the dystopian future he believed inevitable under the Master of Mankind's continued rule. With the Architect of Betrayal now positioned at the highest level of Imperial military command, corruption spread through the command structure with devastating efficiency. Primarchs whose grievances aligned with Horus's manufactured narrative found themselves approached with partial revelations tailored to their specific psychological vulnerabilities. Angron of the World Eaters, his consciousness perpetually distorted by the butcher's nails implanted during his gladiatorial slavery, required minimal persuasion to turn against an emperor he had never truly served willingly. Konrad Kurz of the Night Lords, his sanity eroded by precognitive visions of unavoidable carnage, saw in Horus's rebellion confirmation of his fatalistic worldview. Perturabo of the Iron Warriors, his legion depleted through thankless siege warfare, while others claimed glory in open battle, embraced the opportunity to finally receive recognition proportionate to his sacrifices. Each Primarch who joined the conspiracy brought unique capabilities that, when combined under Horus's strategic genius, created a military force capable of challenging even the master of mankind's carefully constructed Imperium. Most devastating among these conversions was Fulgrim of the Emperor's Children. His legion, which had pursued perfection with obsessive dedication since receiving their Primarch's guidance, fell through that same perfectionism into excesses that corroded their original purpose. The corruption began subtly, with a Xenos weapon recovered during compliance operations, whispering directly into Fulgrim's subconscious. These communications, disguised as the Primarch's own thoughts, gradually reshaped his perception of perfection from disciplined self-mastery into unrestrained experience. Under this influence, the Emperor's children transformed from exemplars of controlled excellence into devotees of excess, their pursuit of sensation superseding all previous loyalties. By the time Fulgrim openly declared for Horus, his legion had become something unrecognizable, transhuman warriors whose capabilities were directed towards self-gratification rather than imperial service. The Alpha Legion's alignment with the conspiracy defied straightforward categorization. Alpharius Omegon, the final Primarch discovered during the Great Crusade, had operated with unprecedented autonomy due to the Emperor's growing preoccupation with the Webway project. This isolation left the XX Legion vulnerable to external influence, particularly from Xenos entities claiming to possess information critical to humanity's survival. The Cabal, as these aliens named themselves, presented Alpharius with visions of two possible futures: the Emperor's victory leading to stagnation and eventual extinction for the human species, or Horus's triumph, causing such self-destructive carnage that the entities corrupting him would burn themselves out along with humanity, preserving the wider galaxy from their influence. This logic, appealing to the Alpha Legion's strategic calculus rather than emotional resentment, produced the most calculated betrayal among the turncoat. Primarch's treason committed in the belief that it served humanity's broader interests through species sacrifice. As these conversions occurred across the expanding Imperium, Horus methodically positioned loyal elements for maximum vulnerability once hostilities commenced. Legions whose Primarchs had rejected his overtures were assigned to distant expeditions where they would be unable to respond quickly when betrayal revealed itself. Fleet distributions were manipulated to ensure numerical superiority for traitor forces in critical theaters. Supply lines for loyalist elements were compromised through insertion of corrupted personnel at key logistics nodes. These preparations, implemented with the War Master's characteristic thoroughness, transformed potential civil discord into carefully orchestrated massacre once the signal for open rebellion was given. That signal came at Istvan III, where loyalist elements within otherwise traitor legions were deployed against supposed planetary rebellion, then subjected to virus bombing by their own fleet assets. This purge, targeting Astartes whose loyalty to the Emperor transcended devotion to their Primarchs, eliminated potential internal resistance while simultaneously revealing the conspiracy's existence to the wider Imperium. Survivors from this initial betrayal, fighting with the desperation of those already condemned, inflicted disproportionate casualties on traitor forces sent to complete their elimination. This unexpected resistance delayed Horus's broader campaign timeline, providing warning to loyal elements that might otherwise have been completely unprepared for what followed. The Emperor, still psychically enthroned containing Magnus's breach into the Webway, received news of the rebellion through Malcador's reports rather than direct observation. His response, filtered through administrative structures never designed for civil conflict, lacked the personal direction that might have coordinated effective counter-strategy. Individual Primarchs loyal to the throne, mobilized according to their own understanding of the threat, without unified command to prevent disastrous misallocations of force. This fragmented response played directly into Horus's strategic design, allowing him to concentrate overwhelming force against isolated loyalist elements. While the Imperium's full military potential remained unrealized due to communication breakdowns and conflicting priorities. The tragedy reached its nadir at Istvan V, where loyalist legions responding to the initial betrayal found themselves victims of a secondary trap. The Iron Warriors, Alpha Legion, Word-Bearers, and Night Lords supposedly arriving as reinforcements for the initial loyalist response instead revealed their true allegiance at the critical moment, turning a planned suppression of traitor forces into the near annihilation of 3 loyal legions. The Raven Guard, Salamanders, and Iron Hands suffered casualties approaching total extinction, their Primarchs killed or missing in action. This dropsite massacre removed a significant portion of the Emperor's remaining military assets in a single engagement, shifting the strategic balance decisively in Horus's favor before the broader Imperium fully comprehended the scope of the rebellion. With loyal forces decimated and the Emperor psychically imprisoned by the Webway breach, Horus launched his drive toward Terra with minimal effective opposition. Traitor fleets divided the Imperium into isolated segments, preventing coordination between surviving loyalist elements. Worlds that had been brought into Imperial compliance through decades of effort found themselves subjected to depredations that made previous Xenos occupation seem merciful by comparison. The instrumentalities of betrayal demons, corrupted Astartes, and warp-twisted technology spread outward from Horus's advance like infection through bloodstream, contaminating regions that would remain compromised long after the heresy's immediate military conclusion. Planets of particular symbolic importance received special attention from the traitor Primarchs, each now expressing corruption that reflected their individual fall from grace. Angron's World Eaters descended upon civilian populations in berserker fury, their butcher's nails implants driving them toward indiscriminate slaughter. Mortarian's Death Guard unleashed plagues that transformed entire ecosystems into necrotic parodies of their former state. Fulgrim's Emperor's Children implemented torture as performance art, their atrocities calculated to inflict maximum suffering rather than efficient death. These specialized horrors, beyond even the considerable brutality of conventional warfare, demonstrated how completely the traitor legions had abandoned not merely loyalty to the Emperor, but the fundamental humanity they had been created to protect. As news of these atrocities reached loyalist forces, the nature of the conflict transformed from political dispute into existential struggle. Space Marine legions that had maintained neutrality or hesitation in what appeared initially as leadership contest between Emperor and Warmaster found moral clarity in the evident corruption consuming the traitor forces. The Ultramarines under Robert Guilliman, having been deliberately dispatched to distant campaign theaters by Horus's manipulations, began the arduous process of returning to Terra's defense despite astronomical distances and degraded warp conditions. The Dark Angels under Lionel Johnson, similarly isolated by pre-betrayal positioning, divided their forces between multiple critical fronts in attempts to contain damage that had already metastasized beyond local response. These belated reactions, while tactically sound within their limited operational contexts, highlighted the strategic disadvantage loyalist forces faced due to Horus's comprehensive preparation and first strike capability. While conventional military assets struggled to respond effectively, other segments of the Imperium structure demonstrated unexpected resilience. The Mechanicum fractured along ideological lines, with traditionalist elements remaining loyal to the Emperor, while heterodox factions embraced the technological liberation promised by Horus's campaign. This division, while weakening immediate manufacturing capacity for loyalist forces, prevented traitor elements from accessing the full industrial potential of Forge worlds across the Imperium. Similarly, the Navigator houses maintained sufficient loyalty to the throne that traitor fleets found themselves dependent on sorcerous alternatives to conventional warp travel methods that proved less reliable and more spiritually corrosive than traditional navigation. These institutional constraints, while insufficient to prevent Horus's advance, established limitations that would eventually contribute to the rebellion's containment. The most significant limitation proved to be time itself. Each day of delayed advance toward Terra allowed loyalist forces to consolidate defensive positions and marshal remaining assets. The immense distances of the Imperium, which had required decades to traverse during the Great Crusade's expansion phase, imposed similar constraints on Horus's attempted reversal of that expansion. Warp travel, never entirely predictable even under optimal conditions, became increasingly unreliable as the psychic disruption caused by widespread violence created turbulence in the Imperium. Fleets that should have maintained formation found themselves separated by temporal distortion, arriving at designated coordinates days or weeks apart rather than in coordinated assault formation. These navigational challenges, combined with the need to secure conquered territory against potential counterattack, prevented the lightning campaign Horus had initially envisioned. This delay proved particularly damaging to the traitor cause due to the inherently unstable nature of the forces Horus had unleashed. The entities from the Imperium that had granted enhanced capabilities to his corrupted legions operated according to their own incomprehensible motivations rather than conventional military doctrine. Alliances between traitor primarchs, founded on shared resentment rather than unified purpose, began fracturing once the initial euphoria of rebellion faded. The word-bearers pursued objectives related to their newfound religious devotion rather than strategic military targets. The Emperor's children abandoned assigned positions in pursuit of sensory experiences regardless of tactical significance. The World Eater's indiscriminate violence rendered them increasingly unsuitable for operations requiring precision or restraint. These divergent priorities transformed Horus's theoretically overwhelming force into a coalition of competing interests, united primarily by momentum toward terror rather than coordinated military purpose. Despite these emergent limitations, the immediate military, Telazos, the situation remained overwhelmingly favorable for traitor forces as they approached the Sol system. 7 of the original 20 Primarchs had declared openly for Horus, bringing their legions considerable military assets to his cause. 3 loyalist Primarchs had been confirmed killed during the drop site massacre, their legions reduced to scattered remnants, incapable of significant independent action. The remaining loyalist Primarchs were dispersed across the Imperium, their forces engaged in desperate holding actions against secondary traitor elements or attempting to reach Terra through increasingly hostile warp conditions. The Emperor remained psychically enthroned, containing the Webway breach, unable to provide direct leadership during the most significant threat humanity had faced since unification. Terra's defenses, though considerable, had never been designed to withstand assault from the very Legiones Astartes that formed the Imperium's offensive capability. The Imperial Palace had been constructed as administrative center and symbolic representation of the Emperor's authority rather than true fortress. Its transformation into defensive stronghold proceeded with frantic urgency under Rogel Dawn's direction. Entire sections demolished and rebuilt according to combat engineering principles rather than ceremonial design. The Imperial Fists, having been fortuitously positioned on Terra when betrayal revealed itself, formed the core of the defensive force alongside whatever loyalist elements had managed to reach the throne world ahead of Horus's advance. These preparations, while tactically sound within their limited scope, could at best delay rather than prevent the overwhelming force approaching Terra's protective void shields. As traitor vessels translated into real space within the Sol system, the final act of the Emperor's tragic miscalculation prepared to unfold. The master strategist who had unified Terra through calculated application of overwhelming force now found himself besieged by his own creations, unable to personally direct the defense of humanity's ancient cradle. The Primarchs designed to extend his vision across the stars now descended upon his sanctuary with the very transhuman capabilities he had engineered into their forms. And the Imperium, conceived as rational alternative to old Knight's superstitious horror, now faced entities whose existence validated the very beliefs the Imperial truth had been designed to eliminate. In this confluence of contradictions lay the essential tragedy of the Horus heresy, a failure not merely of loyalty, but of the Emperor's fundamental conception of humanity's relationship to the universe it inhabited. The seeds of heresy, planted through the Emperor's compromises and nurtured by his absence, had grown into poisoned fruit whose harvest would transform humanity's golden future into millennia of stagnation and despair. The tragedy's final act awaited only Horus's arrival at the gates of the imperial palace, a confrontation whose outcome would determine not merely political leadership, but the fundamental nature of humanity's continued existence in a universe whose true horrors the Emperor had sought to conceal rather than prepare his children to confront. Blood ran in rivers across the killing fields of Istvan III. Viral bombs had transformed its cities into charnel pits, the atmosphere itself becoming a weapon against the loyalist Astartes deployed to the surface. Those who survived the initial bombardment, protected by sealed armor or underground fortifications, faced a more intimate betrayal as their former brothers descended to complete their execution. The Lunar Wolves, Emperor's children, Death Guard, and World Eaters turned their transhuman capabilities against their own, murdering battle brothers with whom they had shed blood across countless campaigns. This fratricidal slaughter marked the War Master's first open declaration of rebellion, a signal that could not be misinterpreted even across the vast distances separating the Istvan system from Terra. The Loyalists fought with desperate valor, knowing their cause was already lost but determined to extract maximum cost for their betrayal. Captain Gaviel Loken of the Lunar Wolves led a resistance that survived weeks beyond all tactical probability, transforming what should have been swift extermination into protracted urban warfare. Each day of continued resistance delayed Horus's broader strategic timeline, providing precious warning to Imperial forces that might otherwise have been completely unprepared for what followed. The final Loyalist positions fell only when Angron himself led World Eaters in berserker assault, the Red Angel's fury overwhelming even the most disciplined defensive formations. With the last Loyalist eliminated, Horus finally possessed an ideologically purified Force legions whose dedication to his rebellion could not be questioned, having proven themselves through the ultimate test of killing their own. While these tragedies unfolded at Istvan III, Imperial response mobilized with ponderous uncertainty. The Emperor, still psychically enthroned, containing Magnus's breach into the webway, received news of the rebellion through Malkador's reports rather than direct observation. His commands, filtered through administrative structures never designed for civil conflict, lacked the personal direction that might have coordinated effective counter-strategy. Individual Primarchs loyal to the throne, mobilized according to their own understanding of the threat, without unified command, to prevent disastrous misallocations of force. This fragmented response played directly into Horus's strategic design, allowing him to concentrate overwhelming force against isolated Loyalist elements, while the Imperium's full military potential remained unrealized due to communication breakdowns and conflicting priorities. Rogel Dorn, Praetorian of Terra, directed the fortification of the Imperial Palace while dispatching the Imperial Fist's fleet elements to reinforce Loyalist positions. Ferrus Manus of the Iron Hands, enraged by his brother's betrayal, led his legion toward direct confrontation without awaiting coordination with other loyal forces. Corvus Corax of the Raven Guard and Vulcan of the Salamanders marshaled their legions alongside Ferrus, believing their combined strength sufficient to crush Horus's rebellion before it could spread. This hasty response, motivated by admirable loyalty but insufficient strategic consideration, delivered 3 loyal legions directly into Horus's carefully prepared trap at Istvan V. Initial reports from the battlefield suggested victory. The Iron Hands, Raven Guard, and Salamanders made planetfall against minimal resistance, establishing beachheads from which they would launch coordinated assault against the traitor legion's positions. Ferrus Manus led his elite Morlocks directly toward Fulgrim's Emperor's children, determined to personally execute the brother who had attempted to sway him toward betrayal during earlier communication. Behind them, 4 additional legions translated into the Istvan system, the Night Lords, Alpha Legion, Wordbearers, and Iron Warriors, supposedly arriving as loyalist reinforcements for the ongoing suppression of Horus's forces. The apparent numerical superiority convinced loyalist commanders to press their attack rather than consolidate defensive positions. This fatal overconfidence transformed into horror as the secondary wave revealed their true allegiance. The Iron Warriors, under Perturabo's cold direction, established artillery positions targeting loyalist rear echelons rather than traitor formations. The word-bearers advanced directly into supposedly friendly positions, with weapons already firing. The Alpha Legion, having infiltrated operatives throughout loyalist command structures, executed precision decapitation strikes that eliminated senior officers in the critical moments when coordinated response might have mitigated the disaster. And the Night Lords descended upon retreating elements with calculated terror tactics designed to maximize confusion rather than combat efficiency. This drop-site massacre, as Imperial histories would name it, transformed a planned suppression of traitor forces into the near annihilation of 3 loyal legions. Ferrus Manus died at Fulgrim's hand, the Primarch of the Emperor's children presenting his brother's severed head to Horus as proof of dedication. Vulcan disappeared amid the carnage, his fate unknown even to his surviving sons. Corvus Corax escaped only through desperate measures, leading a shattered remnant of his once proud legion back toward loyalist territory. The Iron Hands, leaderless and decimated, fragmented into isolated battle groups that would wage independent vengeance campaigns throughout the subsequent conflict. The Salamanders and Raven Guards ceased to exist as coherent fighting forces, their survivors too few to maintain Legion-scale operations without substantial reconstitution. This single engagement removed a significant portion of the Emperor's remaining military assets, shifting the strategic balance decisively in Horus's favor before the broader Imperium fully comprehended the scope of the rebellion. With his position in the Istvan system secured and loyalist rapid response capability effectively neutralized, Horus convened his brother Primarchs to outline the campaign's next phase. The Lunar Wolves, renamed Sons of Horus to emphasize their allegiance to the War Master rather than Terra, would form the spearhead of a direct advance on the throne world itself. Supporting this main thrust, Mortarion's Death Guard and Angron's World Eaters would clear adjacent sectors, eliminating potential loyalist counterattack vectors. Perturabo's Iron Warriors received assignment to neutralize specific fortress systems that might otherwise impede the traitor's advance. The Alpha Legion would operate behind nominal loyalist lines, spreading disinformation and disrupting coordination between still loyal forces. The word-bearers under Lorgar would pursue their own specialized objectives, focusing on systems with significance to the new religious doctrines they had embraced. This distribution of forces balanced military pragmatism with recognition of the increasingly divergent motivations driving the various traitor legions. As these assignments dispersed the traitor forces across the galaxy, they encountered resistance that varied dramatically in both form and effectiveness. Worlds with minimal military presence capitulated immediately. Their populations offered stark choice between compliance with new authorities or immediate extermination. Systems with significant defensive capabilities mounted resistance that ranged from token to fanatical, depending largely on local commanders' personal loyalty to either Emperor or War Master. Most significant opposition came from isolated loyalist Astartes elements, companies or battle groups separated from their main legion forces when the rebellion began, fighting with the transhuman determination their genetic modifications were designed to enable. These scattered impediments, while insufficient to halt Horus's advance, imposed delays that would ultimately prove critical to the conflict's outcome. For the traitor Primarchs, this early campaign phase revealed the first significant manifestations of the bargains they had struck with immaterial powers. Angron's always tenuous control over his rage dissolved entirely as the butcher's nails implanted during his gladiatorial slavery melded with warp energies, transforming the once noble warrior into an avatar of mindless bloodshed. Mortarion, whose stoic endurance had defined his character since childhood on toxic Barbarous, succumbed to plagues that transformed his physical form into leprous parody of its former resilience. Fulgrim surrendered his consciousness entirely to the entity that had first corrupted him through the layer blade, his obsession with perfection inverted into pursuit of excess without limitation. These transformations, while granting terrible new capabilities, eroded the strategic coherence that had made the Primarchs such effective military commanders during the Great Crusade. Most concerning from Horus's perspective was the growing independence of his supposedly subordinate brothers. Lorgar Aurelian, having embraced the primordial truth with religious fervor that mirrored his former worship of the Emperor, diverted word-bearers' assets toward ritual purposes without regard for broader strategic considerations. Conrad Kurz, his sanity deteriorating as precognitive visions of defeat blended with paranoid persecution complexes, deployed the Night Lords with increasing focus on terrorizing civilian populations rather than achieving military objectives. The Alpha Legion operated according to unfathomable internal protocols that often seemed contradictory to external observers, their true purpose comprehensible only to the twins Alpharius and Omegon. These divergent priorities transformed Horus's theoretically overwhelming force into a coalition of competing interests, united primarily by momentum toward terror rather than coordinated military purpose. While the traitor advance progressed despite these internal tensions, loyalist forces struggled to establish coherent response to a threat type never anticipated in Imperial strategic planning. The Legiones Astartes had been designed as conquest instruments rather than counter-insurrection forces, their doctrine oriented toward compliance of non-imperial populations rather than combat against their own kind. No contingency protocols existed for Primarch betrayal, leaving command structures paralyzed by uncertainty regarding proper authority hierarchies when Genefathers turned against the Imperium they had helped establish. This institutional confusion, combined with communications disruptions caused by warp disturbances that accompanied the spreading conflict, prevented effective coordination between loyalist elements during the heresy's critical early phase. Individual loyalty remained the primary determinant of effective resistance. The Ultramarines under Robut Guilliman, having been deliberately dispatched to distant campaign theaters by Horus's pre-rebellion manipulations, began the arduous process of returning to Terra's defense, despite astronomical distances and degraded warp conditions. The Dark Angels under Lionel Johnson, similarly isolated by strategic positioning, divided their forces between multiple critical fronts in attempts to contain damage that had already metastasized beyond local response. The White Scars under Jagatai Khan maintained deliberate neutrality during initial conflict stages, the Khan seeking personal confirmation of allegations against his brother Primarchs before committing his highly mobile forces to either faction. These independent operations, while admirable in their determination, highlighted the strategic disadvantage loyalist forces faced due to Horus's comprehensive preparation and first strike capability. The most significant loyalist counteroffensive developed not through central planning but local initiative. On Mars, traditionally neutral Mechanicum forces fractured along ideological lines, with factions embracing technological innovation previously forbidden by Emperor's decree, declaring for Horus, while traditionalist elements maintained loyalty to established doctrine and, by extension, the throne. The resulting civil conflict transformed the Red Planet into apocalyptic battleground. Manufactorum districts, once dedicated to weapons production, becoming combat zones, where Skitarii clashed with Oathbreaker forces, augmented by prohibited technological horrors. This Martian civil war, unfolding within sight of Terra itself, demonstrated how completely Imperial unity had collapsed, the foundational alliance between Emperor and Mechanicum dissolving into internal conflict precisely when manufacturing capacity was most crucial for the Throne World's defense. Similar fractures appeared throughout supposedly stable Imperial institutions. The Navis Nobilite, comprised of navigator houses essential for warp travel, divided according to complex internal politics that predated the Imperium itself. The Officio Assassinorum, created by Malcador specifically to eliminate threats to Imperial stability, found its various temples pursuing contradictory objectives as their respective masters interpreted loyalty according to personal definitions rather than clear hierarchical direction. Even the Adeptus Arbites, designed to maintain legal consistency across diverse human worlds, discovered their supposedly universal imperial law contained no provisions for determining legitimacy when authority itself came into question. These institutional failures revealed the underlying fragility of an empire constructed around single, irreplaceable leadership figure, precisely the vulnerability the emperor had sought to address through creating the Primarchs as distributed authority nodes. As these internal conflicts consumed resources that should have been directed toward external defense, Horus's advance continued with calculated deliberation. Rather than driving directly toward Terra along the most efficient warp routes, the War Master implemented system-by-system conquest strategy designed to secure his eventual supply lines while denying loyalist forces potential rally points for counterattack. This methodical approach reflected both military pragmatism and psychological warfare. Each conquered system became showcase for the rebellion's apparent inevitability, encouraging wavering planetary governors to declare for Horus rather than face similar fate. By the time the traitor armada approached Segmentum Solar, hundreds of worlds had transferred allegiance to the War Master without firing a shot, their ruling classes calculating survival odds with cold probability analysis rather than ideological commitment. Not all systems proved so pragmatically malleable. Several fortress worlds, designed as defensive linchpins during the Great Crusade's expansion phase, maintained fanatical loyalty to the Emperor despite overwhelming traitor force deployed against them. These holdouts, while ultimately doomed against the concentrated attention of entire traitor legions, imposed significant delays on Horus's timeline through sheer stubbornness. The War Master, recognizing the strategic mathematics of time versus territory, assigned Perturabo's Iron Warriors primary responsibility for reducing these obstacles, a task. The Dour Primarch approached with methodical efficiency that matched his reputation as the Imperium's preeminent siege warfare specialist. Each fortress fell eventually, but their defenders extracted maximum cost in time and resources before capitulation. While conventional military assets struggled against traitor advance, unconventional resistance emerged from unexpected sources. Malcador the Sigillite, exercising authority as the Emperor's regent, activated networks of operatives planted throughout the Imperium during its formation, specifically to counter potential internal threats. These agents, later formalized as the Inquisition's earliest precursors, operated independently from compromised command structures, utilizing specialized training and equipment to disrupt traitor operations through targeted assassination, sabotage, and intelligence collection. Their effectiveness varied dramatically across theaters, but collectively, they imposed friction on traitor logistics that contributed to the advance's gradually decreasing momentum. More significant resistance came from loyalist Astartes pursuing independent operations behind traitor lines. The Shattered, Legion's survivors from the Dropsite massacre who had escaped annihilation at Istvan V, reformed into mixed Legion battle groups united by shared purpose rather than original organizational structures. These composite forces, operating without support from traditional Imperial logistics, adapted guerrilla warfare techniques to exploit their intimate knowledge of Legiones Astartes' operational patterns. Their hit-and-run attacks against traitor supply lines and isolated detachments imposed disproportionate damage relative to their limited numbers, forcing Horus to divert resources toward rear area security that would have been better employed in the main advance toward Terra. As the conflict spread across the Imperium's vast expanse, its character transformed from recognizable military campaign into something transcending conventional categorization. The immaterial powers supporting Horus's rebellion gained increasing influence over physical reality as violence and suffering proliferated across human-settled space. Entire systems disappeared behind warp storms that defied navigation, their eventual fate unknown even millennia later. Planetary populations experienced mass psychosis as sensitive individuals received unfiltered contact with entities from beyond material existence. Temporal anomalies created situations where cause and effect operated in reverse sequence, battles concluding before they began or continuing for subjective centuries, while only hours passed in surrounding space. These reality distortions, incomprehensible to most Imperial citizens, represented the true nature of the conflict emerging from behind materialist explanations, a war not merely for political control, but for humanity's metaphysical definition. The traitor legions embraced these transformations with varying degrees of enthusiasm and comprehension. The word-bearers under Lorgar Aurelian cultivated deliberate immaterial corruption, their chaplains leading rituals that transformed Astartes' physiology according to doctrinal interpretations of the entities they now worshipped. The Death Guard under Mortarion experienced collective transformation after warp misjump trapped their fleet in immaterial space, the Legion's vaunted resilience becoming grotesque parody as plague entities remade their bodies into vectors for supernatural contagion. The Emperor's children abandoned military discipline entirely, their pursuit of sensory experience superseding strategic objectives as they descended into excess that defied description in conventional language. These divergent evolutions, while increasing individual legions' specialized effectiveness, further degraded the traitor coalition's operational coherence. Horus himself underwent transformation more subtle but no less significant than his brother's physical mutations. The entity that had corrupted him through the anathema wound on Davin gradually expanded its influence throughout his consciousness, providing tactical insights and raw power that compensated for increasing strategic friction. His decisions acquired prescient quality that anticipated loyalist countermoves before implementation, while his personal combat capabilities expanded beyond even Primarch baseline into something approaching the Emperor's own transhuman majesty. These enhancements came with corresponding cost in personality erosion. The charismatic leader who had inspired unqualified loyalty throughout the Great Crusade became increasingly cold and calculating, his previous emotional connections replaced by pure instrumentality. By the time the traitor armada approached Sol System, the being commanding it retained Horus's appearance and memories but operated according to motivations that transcended his original personality. The Sol System's outer defenses activated as traitor fleet elements translated into real space at system edge, automated weapons, platforms and minefields, implementing protocols designed for Xenos invasion, rather than returning Imperial vessels. These initial obstacles proved minimally effective against the combined void warfare expertise of multiple Space Marine legions, naval elements, clustered around Jupiter's orbital stations, their captains implementing desperate defensive maneuvers that traded ships for time in calculated war of attrition. The void battle for Sol System unfolded across three-dimensional space, measured in millions of kilometers, dwarfing previous human conflicts in both scale and technological intensity. While traitor vessels advanced methodically through these outer defenses, Terra itself underwent transformation from administrative center into fortress world. Rogel Dawn, the Emperor's Praetorian, implemented defensive preparations with characteristic thoroughness, his Imperial Fists Legion applying siege warfare expertise toward defensive purpose rather than their usual offensive operations. Existing palace fortifications designed primarily as symbolic representations of Imperial authority were reinforced according to practical combat engineering principles, their ceremonial aspects subordinated to functional requirements. Civilian populations found themselves conscripted into construction battalions or evacuation operations, depending on individual capabilities, the Imperium's capital experiencing compression from planetary society into pure military installation focused singularly on the coming confrontation. The Emperor himself remained within the Imperial Palace's deepest vaults, his physical form seated upon the Golden Throne, while his psychic consciousness maintained constant vigilance against the warp breach created by Magnus's ill-fated warning. This dual imprisonment body contained within mechanical support apparatus, while mind focused eternally on dimensional rupture, prevented his direct participation in defensive preparations. Communications with the Master of Mankind occurred exclusively through Malkador the Sigillite, who translated the Emperor's increasingly abstract thought patterns into practical directives for military leaders attempting to coordinate Terra's defense. This fragmented command structure, with ultimate authority inaccessible during existential crisis, epitomized the fundamental vulnerability created by the Emperor's obsessive focus on the Webway project at the expense of contingency preparation. As traitor fleet elements secured positions throughout the inner Sol system, Horus faced decision regarding assault prioritization. Mars remained contested between Mechanicum factions, its manufacturing capacity representing strategic prize beyond mere planetary conquest. Luna housed shipyards and weapons testing facilities whose capture would provide significant tactical advantages for the subsequent assault on Terra itself. Multiple Primarchs advocated for securing these secondary objectives before commencing direct attack on the throne world, arguing that comprehensive system control would ensure eventual victory even if initial palace assault proved more costly than anticipated. Horus, however, recognized intangible factors beyond conventional strategic calculus. Each day of delayed confrontation allowed not only improved defensive preparation, but potential loyalist reinforcement from legions racing toward Terra from distant presses. Deployments. The War Master ordered immediate commencement of what Imperial histories would name the Siege of Terra, the direct assault on humanity's ancient cradle and the Emperor's seat of power. The initial landings established traitor footholds across Terra's surface, with particular concentration on approaches to the Imperial Palace complex. The Sons of Horus secured primary assault corridors, their tactics reflecting Chthonian gang warfare, adapted to planetary scale as they advanced through urban terrain with methodical building-to-building clearance operations. The World Eaters under Angron implemented less discriminate approach, their Primarchs' uncontrolled bloodlust driving them toward palace walls with minimal concern for tactical positioning or casualty rates. The Death Guard established biological warfare operations that transformed entire districts into uninhabitable plague zones, their advance preceded by contagions that transcended material science to incorporate supernatural vectors of infection. The Emperor's children, having largely abandoned conventional military objectives, conducted parallel operations focused on civilian population centers, their atrocities designed to generate emotional resonance that strengthened their patrons' influence over the battlefield. Defending against this multi-vector assault, Loyalist forces implemented layered resistance that traded space for time according to classic defensive doctrine. The Imperial Fists formed the defensive operations core, their Primarch Rogel Dawn having transformed the palace complex into concentric fortification rings tailored to maximize attacker casualties at each successive layer. The White Scars, having resolved their initial neutrality in favor of Imperial loyalty, utilized their unmatched mobility to conduct rapid response operations against traitor forces that penetrated outer defensive perimeters. The Blood Angels, arriving at Terra just before warp routes became completely impassable due to increasing immaterial disturbance, deployed primarily as counter-assault elements, their aggressive combat doctrine making them ideal for operations requiring recapture of lost positions. These Legiones Astartes elements received support from Legio Custodes, Sisters of Silence, Solar Auxilia, and Mechanicum Loyalists, a defensive coalition of unprecedented diversity unified by existential necessity rather than coordinated planning. The palace's outer walls fell within days despite this determined resistance, traitor numerical superiority, and corrupted capabilities, overwhelming defenses designed for conventional rather than warp-augmented assault. Perturabo's Iron Warriors applied siege warfare expertise that systematically identified and exploited structural vulnerabilities, their artillery batteries maintaining continuous bombardment, while assault teams breached specific wall sections according to predetermined sequence. The Night Lords utilized terror tactics against both military defenders and civilian support personnel, their psychological warfare creating cascade of defensive coordination failures that undermined otherwise sound tactical positions. The Alpha Legion operated throughout allegedly secure palace sections, their infiltrators having established deep cover identities months or years before open hostilities began. These complementary pressure vectors forced continuous defensive redeployment, gradually eroding loyalist capacity to maintain coherent resistance as the siege progressed from outer fortifications toward the palace's inner sanctums. As physical defenses deteriorated, the conflict's immaterial aspects intensified correspondingly. The concentration of violence and desperation surrounding the palace created psychic resonance that thinned barriers between material reality and the warp. Entities previously confined to immaterial existence manifested directly on Terra's surface, no longer requiring possession of human vessels to influence physical events. The traitor Primarchs themselves underwent further transformation as their patrons' power concentrated around the siege's focal point, their already transhuman capabilities elevated toward godlike status through supernatural enhancement. Most significant among these manifestations was Horus himself, the War Master's form becoming vessel for powers whose true nature transcended comprehension even by other Primarchs. The being directing the traitor forces in the siege's final stages retained increasingly tenuous connection to the personality that had once been the Emperor's favored son. The defenders, while lacking comparable warp augmentation, discovered unexpected sources of counter-supernatural capability. The Sisters of Silence, their null field auras creating zones where immaterial entities could not maintain physical coherence, became linchpin defensive assets deployed at critical junctures to neutralize otherwise insurmountable warp manifestations. The Legio Custodes displayed resistance to corrupting influence that exceeded even Space Marine resilience, their unique creation process having incorporated protections unavailable to mass-produced Astartes. Most unexpected was the emergence of Faith as counter-warp vector Imperial Army units and civilian auxiliaries, discovering that unshakable belief in the Emperor's divinity sometimes produced tangible protective effects against warp entities. This spontaneous religious response, directly contradicting the Imperial Truth's materialist principles, represented early manifestation of what would eventually become the Imperial cult, an institution antithetical to the Emperor's original vision, yet ultimately essential for humanity's continued survival. The siege reached its climax as traitor forces breached the Eternity Gate, the final significant barrier before the Imperial Palace's Sanctum Imperialis, where the Emperor's physical form remained enthroned. The Blood Angels under Sanguinius established defensive position at this ultimate threshold, their Primarch embodying defiance against overwhelming odds as he personally held the narrow approach against waves of traitor Astartes and warp entities. This last stand, immortalized in countless subsequent Imperial depictions, acquired mythic resonance that transcended its immediate tactical significance. Sanguinius represented not merely military resistance but philosophical rejection of the corruption. Horus embodied loyalty maintained without reservation, even in circumstances where pragmatic calculation would have indicated capitulation as only rational response. At this moment of imminent loyalist defeat, strategic developments beyond Terra fundamentally altered the conflict's trajectory. The Ultramarines and Dark Angels, having overcome astronomical distances and increasingly hostile warp conditions, translated into real space within the Sol system. These fresh loyalist legions, operating at peak combat efficiency unlike the siege-depleted defenders, presented Horus with strategic dilemma that defied simple resolution. Continuing ground operations against the palace would eventually secure victory, but not before loyalist reinforcements established orbit to surface fire superiority that would render Pyrrhic. Retreating to regroup would sacrifice momentum gained through months of continuous assault, allowing defensive reconsolidation that might prove insurmountable in subsequent engagement. The War Master, recognizing Decision Point's historic significance, implemented third option that demonstrated both his tactical brilliance and the extent to which strategic calculation had replaced emotional connection in his transformed consciousness. Horus ordered simultaneous lowering of void shields protecting his flagship Vengeful Spirit, transforming the vessel from combat platform into deliberately vulnerable target. This action, incomprehensible according to conventional military doctrine, represented direct challenge to the Emperor. Personal combat between creator and creation to determine humanity's future rather than continued grinding attrition between their respective forces. The psychic emanations accompanying this challenge ensured its proper interpretation within the palace, where the Emperor received the message with grim recognition of its necessity. After transferring his position on the Golden Throne to Malkador the Sigillite, a temporary measure that would cost the regent his life through psychic burnout, the master of mankind prepared for direct confrontation with his fallen son. Accompanying him in this final mission were Sanguinius of the Blood Angels and Rogel Dawn of the Imperial Fists, loyal sons providing final escort before what all recognized as the conflict's inevitable conclusion. The Loyalist boarding party teleported directly into predetermined coordinates aboard the Vengeful Spirit, materializing amidst defenses specifically designed to separate the Emperor from his Primarch guardians. Warp turbulence generated by concentrated psychic activity scattered the teleport pattern, isolating team members throughout the massive vessel's labyrinthine interior. Sanguinius, materializing closest to Horus's command chamber, encountered the War Master alone, perfect warrior, confronting corrupted strategist in single combat that represented conflict in microcosm. Despite his unmatched martial prowess, the Angel of Baal proved inadequate against Horus's warp-enhanced capabilities. Sanguinius fell to his brother's talons, his death inflicting psychological wound upon his legion that would manifest as the Black Rage in subsequent millennia, a psychic echo of betrayal experienced by Blood Angels in moment of their Primarch's murder. The Emperor, arriving at Horus's sanctum after fighting through layers of defenders both material and immaterial, discovered his favored son transformed beyond recognition. The being that awaited him retained Horus's physical appearance, but radiated presence that transcended mere Primarch stature. The entities supporting his rebellion, having invested their chosen vessel with power, approaching the Emperor's own capabilities. What followed was combat operating simultaneously across physical, mental, and spiritual dimensions, blows exchanged on material plane, while psychic assaults contested metaphysical territory and fundamental principles clashed on philosophical level. This multi-layered conflict, incomprehensible to observers lacking trans-dimensional perception, represented final adjudication of competing visions for humanity's future. The Emperor's controlled evolution towards psychic ascension versus the chaotic transcendence offered by warp entities operating through Horus as their instrument. In the battle's final moments, the Emperor recognized terrible truth that had eluded him throughout the heresy. Horus was not merely corrupted but fundamentally hollowed, his original personality almost completely replaced by the entities that had granted him power. The being confronting him retained Horus's memories and capabilities but operated according to motivations antithetical to humanity's survival. This recognition freed the Emperor from emotional constraints that had previously limited his response to the rebellion, allowing full deployment of his psychic might without reservation previously imposed by paternal connection. The resulting metaphysical confrontation obliterated Horus's soul from existence, while simultaneously depleting the Emperor's power to extent that his physical form sustained mortal wounds. Rogel Dawn, fighting through to the command chamber after facing his own gauntlet of obstacles, discovered tragedy already concluded the Emperor's broken body beside Horus's empty vessel and Sanguinius's murdered form. The Praetorian of Terror fulfilled his final duty by returning his creator to the Golden Throne, where Malkador's disintegrating form yielded its position in final act of sacrifice. The Emperor, his consciousness fragmented by the confrontation's metaphysical trauma, provided minimal instructions for the modification of the Golden Throne from webway interface into life support mechanism. This improvised solution preserved his physical form in state of living death, neither truly alive nor completely deceased, but suspended in eternal moment between existence states, while his scattered consciousness gradually reintegrated across millennia of subjective experience. With Horus destroyed and the Emperor mortally wounded, the traitor forces lost both coordinating leadership and motivating purpose simultaneously. The corrupted Primarchs, no longer united by the War Master's strategic direction, reverted to pursuing individual agendas that frequently contradicted collective interest. The Loyalist reinforcements, establishing orbit to surface fire superiority as anticipated, rendered continued planetary assault tactically untenable. Traitor elements began general retreat that rapidly transformed into rout as coordination collapsed at all command levels. The Siege of Terra concluded not through decisive military action, but entropic dissolution, the traitor coalition's internal coherence dissipating once its focal nexus was removed. This disintegration continued as traitor forces withdrew from the Sol system, their retreat lacking organized evacuation plans that might have preserved combat effectiveness for subsequent operations. The Ultramarines and Dark Angels pursued with methodical determination, their fresh forces inflicting disproportionate casualties on disorganized traitor elements, attempting to translate into the warp without proper navigational preparation. The corrupted legions fragmented along internal fault lines that had developed throughout the heresy, companies and battle groups separating according to personal loyalties or specialized corruption rather than original organizational structures. By the time these retreating elements reached relative safety within warp storms surrounding the region later named Eye of Terror, they had transformed from coherent military forces into specialized warbands, united primarily by shared corruption rather than command hierarchy. The Loyalist forces, while technically victorious, emerged from the conflict in condition that precluded restoration of pre-heresy status quo. Half the original Space Marine legions had turned traitor, leaving massive void in the Imperium's offensive military capability. Terra itself had suffered ecological damage, rendering most of its surface uninhabitable outside protected zones like the Imperial Palace complex. Mars remained disputed between Mechanicum factions, its manufacturing output reduced to fraction of previous capacity. Most significantly, the Emperor's physical incapacitation created leadership vacuum precisely when unified direction was most needed for effective reconstruction. The Imperium had survived its greatest existential threat, but at cost that transformed recovery into process spanning millennia rather than decades. In the ashes of civil war, Robert Guilliman assumed practical leadership of remaining Loyalist forces. The Ultramarines Primarch, having maintained his legion's strength through geographic isolation from the heresy's most destructive theaters, possessed both material resources and administrative acumen required for reconstruction efforts. His Codex Astartes, initially tactical manual for his own legion's operations, became template for post-heresy reorganization of all Loyalist Space Marines, its most significant provision requiring division of remaining legions into 1,000 Marine chapters to prevent future accumulation of power comparable to what had enabled the traitor's initial effectiveness. This restructuring, while tactically disadvantaging individual Astartes formations, created strategic resilience through distributed authority that would prove essential for the Imperium's long-term survival. More profound than these practical adjustments was the philosophical transformation that redefined the Imperium's fundamental nature. The Emperor, having rejected religious veneration throughout the Great Crusade, became object of worship precisely when his direct guidance became inaccessible. Imperial populations, seeking meaning amid catastrophe that defied rational explanation, spontaneously developed devotional practices, focused on the master of mankind's sacrifice. What began as grassroots psychological response gradually formalized into institutional structures, with imperial cult eventually achieving status as state religion despite contradicting the emperor's explicit preferences. This transformation from secular empire to theocratic state represented final repudiation of the imperial truth, a philosophical framework proven inadequate for humanity's actual circumstances through the exact catastrophe it had been designed to prevent. The Horus heresy thus concluded not merely with military victory for Loyalist forces, but complete redefinition of the Imperium's essential character. The rational, expansionist civilization envisioned by the Emperor during the Great Crusade yielded to paranoid, insular theocracy focused primarily on preventing further catastrophe rather than achieving transcendent potential. The Primarchs, designed as transhuman exemplars who would lead humanity toward evolutionary advancement, largely disappeared through death or withdrawal, leaving stunted institutions staffed by lesser beings to interpret their legacies. And the Emperor himself, having rejected godhood throughout his visible existence, achieved divine status precisely when his capacity to refute such designation was eliminated. In this confluence of ironies lay the essential tragedy of the heresy, a conflict that preserved humanity's existence, while simultaneously ensuring it would never achieve the potential for which such preservation was originally intended. The Golden Throne stood silent in the deepest vault of the Imperial Palace, its mechanisms humming with energy beyond mortal comprehension. Upon this ancient device of alien origin sat the broken form of humanity's master, neither alive nor dead, but suspended in eternal agony between states of existence. The Emperor of mankind, architect of humanity's greatest ascension and witness to its most profound fall, endured in undying torment, while his shattered consciousness struggled to reintegrate across dimensions beyond material comprehension. His physical body, once the pinnacle of human perfection, had deteriorated into withered husk, sustained only through arcane technologies whose original purpose had been distorted to serve this grim imprisonment. 10,000 souls were sacrificed daily to maintain his flicker of existence, their life energy consumed to prevent the final extinguishment of humanity's last, best hope. The aftermath of the Horus Heresy unfolded in atmosphere of desperate improvisation. Rogel Dawn, having returned the Emperor's ruined form from the vengeful spirit, faced decisions that would shape humanity's existence for millennia to come. The Golden Throne, originally constructed as interface mechanism for the Imperial Webway project, required immediate modification to serve as life support apparatus. The Emperor's final, fragmented instructions provided minimal guidance for this conversion, leaving Dawn dependent on technical expertise from Mechanicum loyalists who understood neither the device's true purpose nor the metaphysical principles underlying its function. What resulted was a masterpiece of desperate engineering, a mechanism that preserved the Emperor's physical form while allowing his fractured consciousness to maintain essential psychic functions that had become integral to the Imperium's continued operation. Chief among these functions was maintenance of the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that enabled warp navigation throughout Imperial space. The Emperor had personally powered this signal throughout the Great Crusade, his unmatched psychic might providing stable reference point by which Navigator houses guided vessels through otherwise unnavigable immaterium. With his consciousness fragmented and physical form incapacitated, this function required adaptation to operate through increasingly ritualized processes. The Adeptus Astronomica developed around this necessity, thousands of trained psychers channeling their abilities through the Emperor's shattered mind to maintain navigation capability essential for Imperial coherence. Each psyker burned out within months of assignment, their mortal forms unable to withstand proximity to such concentrated psychic energy, creating endless demand for replacement that drove the Black Ship's constant harvest across human-settled worlds. Parallel to this psychic infrastructure, the Imperium's governance underwent radical reorganization in the heresy's immediate aftermath. Robote Guilliman, emerging as de facto imperial leader through combination of practical capability and remaining military assets, implemented structures codified in his Codex Astartes to prevent future accumulation of power comparable to what had enabled the traitor's initial effectiveness. The Legiones Astartes, originally conceived as 20 distinct forces each unified under single Primarch's command, were divided into 1,000 marine chapters with independent command hierarchies. This restructuring, while tactically disadvantaging individual Astartes formations, created strategic resilience through distributed authority that would prove essential for the Imperium's long-term survival against both external threats and potential internal rebellion. This military reorganization represented merely the most visible aspect of broader institutional transformation. The Council of Terra, established by the Emperor before his incapacitation to manage civilian administration, evolved into the High Lord's Oligarchic Council, comprising leaders from the Imperium's most powerful organizations, each representing specific aspects of imperial function. The Adeptus Terra expanded from coordinating body into labyrinthine bureaucracy, whose processes gradually acquired ritual significance, transcending their practical purpose. The Adeptus Mechanicus formalized its autonomy within strictly defined parameters, securing monopoly on the Brovac and technological knowledge while accepting increasingly restrictive theological constraints on innovation. These institutions developed not according to coherent design but through competitive adaptation to power vacuum created by the Emperor's effective absence, their forms shaped by immediate necessity rather than long-term planning. Most profound among these transformations was the emergence of imperial cult. The Emperor, having rejected religious veneration throughout the Great Crusade and enshrined secular rationalism in the imperial truth, became object of worship precisely when his direct guidance became inaccessible. This development began as spontaneous psychological response among civilian populations, seeking meaning amid catastrophe that defied rational explanation. Devotional practices focused on the Emperor's sacrifice provided emotional framework that stabilized societies shattered by civil war's trauma. What began as grassroots coping mechanism gradually formalized into institutional structures, with isolated worship practices coalescing into recognizable theology that attributed divine status to the enthroned master of mankind. The spread of this nascent faith across the fractured Imperium followed patterns that revealed underlying psychological imperatives rather than coordinated evangelism. Worlds that had suffered most directly during the heresy embraced religious interpretation most fervently, their populations psychologically unable to process such complete betrayal of rational order without transcendent explanatory framework. Isolated systems rediscovered during post-heresy consolidation often had independently developed emperor worship, suggesting convergent theological evolution in response to shared trauma even without direct communication. Military units that had faced warp-corrupted adversaries recognized faith's tangible protective effects against immaterial threats, their practical experiences validating theological claims that might otherwise have been dismissed as primitive superstition. Initially, imperial leadership maintained official adherence to the imperial truth, despite this spreading religiosity. Guilliman, Dawn, and other surviving loyalist primarchs had internalized the emperor's secular vision too deeply to abandon it, even in his absence. The Codex Astartes contained no theological components, presenting itself as practical military manual rather than spiritual guidance. Administrative directives continued emphasizing rational governance according to material principles rather than divine mandate. This official secularism persisted even as practical concessions to religious sentiment became increasingly common. Military chaplains, originally appointed as political officers, gradually assuming pseudo-priestly functions. Administrative decrees, acquiring ritualistic components that enhanced compliance through religious association. Commemorative observances for heresy martyrs incorporating devotional practices indistinguishable from religious ceremonies. This tension between official doctrine and practical reality resolved through generational transition rather than formal policy revision. As the primarchs gradually disappeared from active imperial leadership through death, disappearance, or voluntary withdrawal, they were replaced by individuals who had experienced the emperor only through his absence rather than direct interaction. To these successors, the distinction between venerating the emperor as humanity's perfect exemplar versus worshipping him as literal deity represented semantic quibble rather than fundamental philosophical difference. The imperial truth, designed for expansion phase Imperium guided by the emperor's direct presence, proved inadequate framework for sustaining civilization defined primarily by his absence. Faith provided psychological infrastructure that rationalism could not match under actual conditions facing post-heresy humanity. The emperor's own, The perspective on this transformation remains unknowable. His shattered consciousness, fragmented across both material and immaterial dimensions, no longer possessed capacity for coherent communication beyond occasional psychic impressions interpreted by individuals already predisposed towards specific understandings. The Sisters of Silence, whose null field abilities might have provided objective verification of such communications, found their numbers and influence diminished in post-heresy power realignments. The Adeptus Custodes, who maintained eternal vigil around the Golden Throne, preserved absolute silence regarding any potential messages they might have received from their enthroned master. In this communicative void, all imperial factions could claim alignment with Emperor's will while advancing institutional interests shaped by factors far removed from his original vision. The formal establishment of imperial cult as state religion occurred through process spanning centuries rather than discrete declaration. The ecclesiarchy emerged from consolidation of previously independent devotional organizations, each having developed distinct theological interpretations of the emperor's nature and humanity's proper relationship to him. These disparate traditions underwent bureaucratic homogenization parallel to similar standardization processes occurring throughout imperial administration, with variant practices either suppressed as heretical or incorporated into orthodox doctrine through interpretive frameworks that maintained surface unity despite underlying contradictions. By the time the ecclesiarch achieved position among high lords of terror, religious interpretation of imperial governance had become too thoroughly integrated into administrative function for meaningful separation. This religious transformation carried particular irony given the emperor's explicit rejection of divine status throughout his active existence. The imperial truth had specifically identified superstition as humanity's fundamental vulnerability, with religious belief categorized as primitive misunderstanding to be replaced by rational comprehension of universe's actual mechanisms. The emperor had tolerated Mechanicum's ritualistic approach to technology and Navigator House's quasi-mystical relationship with the warp as practical necessities, but never acknowledged legitimate spiritual dimension to human experience. Yet the Imperium that claimed his authority became defined primarily by religious observance, so pervasive that secularism itself acquired heretical association. In this inversion lay perhaps the heresy's most profound victory, the Emperor's civilization, embracing precisely the mindset he had identified as humanity's greatest weakness. While these philosophical transformations unfolded across the Imperium, practical reconstruction proceeded with mechanical persistence that transcended ideological considerations. The Mechanicum reorganized as Adeptus Mechanicus with more explicitly religious orientation, gradually restored manufacturing capability sufficient to replace material losses from the heresy, though technological understanding continued declining as practical maintenance of existing systems replaced innovation as primary focus. The Navis Nobilite replenished its numbers through carefully managed breeding programs, ensuring warp navigation capability despite increasing turbulence in the Immaterium. The various branches of Imperial military, Astra Militarum, descended from Imperial Army, Adeptus Astartes, restructured from Space Marine legions, and specialized formations like Ordo Tempestus, re-established operational doctrines adapted to post-heresy strategic realities rather than Great Crusade's expansion mandate. These reconstruction efforts faced opposition from both internal and external sources. The traitor forces, having retreated into Warpstorm region subsequently named Eye of Terror, conducted periodic raids against imperial worlds whenever immaterial conditions permitted translation into real space. These incursions, while lacking strategic coherence that had characterized Horus's campaign, inflicted disproportionate damage due to warp-enhanced capabilities developed during extended immersion in Immaterium's corrupting environment. Defending against such threats required specialized formations like Grey Knight's psychically active Space Marine chapter operating under Inquisition authority rather than standard Codex organization whose existence remained officially unacknowledged even within broader imperial hierarchy. More insidious than these external attacks was continued internal vulnerability to corruption similar to what had enabled the heresy itself. The ruinous powers, having demonstrated capacity to turn even primarchs against their creator, represented ongoing threat to imperial integrity that could not be eliminated through conventional military means. The Inquisition developed in response to this persistent vulnerability, its foundations established by Malcador the Sigillite before his sacrifice on the Golden Throne. This organization, operating outside standard imperial command structures with authority, derived directly from the Emperor's historical mandate, assumed responsibility for identifying and eliminating internal threats before they could metastasize into systemic corruption. Its methods, unrestricted by legal constraints or proportionality considerations, reflected existential nature of the threats it was designed to counter. These defensive adaptations, while practically necessary for survival, accelerated the Imperium's transformation from expansionist civilization into paranoid fortress state. Knowledge became compartmentalized according to need-to-know principles that minimized potential damage from individual corruption but prevented holistic understanding essential for true progress. Communication between imperial organizations occurred through ritualized interfaces that prioritized security over efficiency, creating institutional friction that consumed resources better applied to external threats. Innovation became suspect by definition, with deviation from established patterns automatically triggering suspicion regardless of potential benefits. These tendencies, initially implemented as temporary security measures during post-heresy consolidation, gradually embedded themselves as permanent features of imperial culture, adaptations that prevented immediate collapse while ensuring long-term stagnation. This cultural calcification manifested most visibly in technological regression that defined post-heresy millennia. The Adeptus Mechanicus, having reorganized its internal structures to emphasize religious orthodoxy over scientific inquiry, approached technology as archaeological discipline rather than progressive science. Technical knowledge became matter of preserving ancient understanding rather than developing new capabilities, with innovation permitted only through rediscovery of lost standard template construct patterns rather than genuine invention. This approach, while preventing dangerous experimentation with technologies vulnerable to warp corruption, simultaneously ensured that imperial technological capability would remain perpetually inferior to what humanity had achieved during Dark Age of technology. The resultant technological stasis transformed warfare from rapid evolution of capabilities into ritualized application of established patterns, with millennia passing between significant doctrinal adaptations. Similar stagnation affected imperial governance, with administrative processes acquiring ritualistic significance that superseded their practical function. The administratum bureaucratic apparatus, responsible for coordinating imperial operations across millions of worlds, expanded into labyrinthine complexity that defied rational analysis, its procedures sustained through institutional momentum rather than demonstrable effectiveness. Documentation requirements multiplied beyond information processing capacity, creating situations where centuries might pass between query and response. Positions of authority became defined by adherence to procedural orthodoxy rather than practical outcomes, with innovation penalized as potential corruption regardless of demonstrable benefits. This systematic prioritization of process over results gradually transformed imperial administration from practical governance into ritualized performance, whose connection to actual human welfare grew increasingly tenuous. Throughout these institutional transformations, the Emperor endured in solitary agony upon the Golden Throne. His physical form, sustained through combination of arcane technology and daily sacrifice of psychic individuals, deteriorated with glacial inevitability despite all preservation efforts. The mechanisms of the throne itself, understood by increasingly few technical adepts as knowledge loss accelerated across the millennia, required constant maintenance that became progressively more ritualistic as underlying principles faded from comprehension. The Astronomicon continued functioning through processes that merged technology with religious observance, the distinction between mechanical operation and spiritual devotion blurring beyond meaningful separation. The Emperor's shattered consciousness, stretched simultaneously across material reality and immaterial dimensions beyond human comprehension, maintained functions essential for humanity's survival through determination that transcended conventional understanding of will. This determination manifested through phenomena increasingly interpreted through religious rather than rational frameworks. Imperial saints, individuals who displayed capabilities inexplicable through conventional understanding, appeared during periods of extreme crisis, their powers bearing suspicious similarity to abilities demonstrated by the Primarchs during the Great Crusade. The Legion of the Damned Astartes warriors who materialized during desperate battles before disappearing upon victory's achievement intervened in situations where defeat seemed mathematically inevitable, according to standard tactical analysis. The Imperial Tarot divination system, developed by integrating warp-sensitive symbolic interpretation with statistical probability calculation, provided guidance with accuracy exceeding random chance by margins that defied non-spiritual explanation. These phenomena, while insufficient to reverse the Imperium's overall decline, prevented complete collapse during periods where conventional capabilities proved inadequate against emergent threats. Celestine, the most prominent of these saints, demonstrated capabilities that directly contradicted the Imperial Truth's materialist foundations. Her ability to manifest wings of pure light, resurrect after death, and inspire supernatural combat effectiveness in nearby Imperial forces suggested direct connection to the Emperor's fractured consciousness rather than mere psychological phenomenon or technological deception. Similarly, the Sisters of Battle, all-female military organization serving as Ecclesiarchy's armed component, occasionally manifested faith-based abilities that produced effects indistinguishable from psychic powers despite involving individuals with no measurable warp sensitivity. These observations, systematically documented across multiple independent instances, forced even the most skeptical imperial authorities to acknowledge spiritual dimension to human experience that the Emperor had explicitly rejected throughout his visible existence. The philosophical implications of these developments extended beyond merely practical considerations of governance or military effectiveness. If the Emperor, being of demonstrably superior intellect and understanding compared to ordinary humans, had been fundamentally wrong about religion's legitimacy as framework for interpreting reality, what other aspects of his vision might have been similarly flawed? This question, while rarely articulated explicitly due to its heretical implications, underpinned persistent tension between the Imperium as actually existed versus idealized version presented in official histories. The civilization that claimed continuity with the Emperor's original creation had, in fundamental aspects, evolved into precisely the opposite of what he had intended, an irony appreciated only by the vanishingly few individuals with access to unredacted historical records from the Great Crusade era. Among these rare individuals with comprehensive historical perspective, divergent interpretations emerged regarding the Emperor's current status. Some maintained that his consciousness had fragmented beyond recovery, with the entity sustaining the Astronomicon and occasionally manifesting through saints representing mere psychic echo of his original being rather than coherent personality. Others suggested evolution rather than degradation, the Emperor's consciousness expanding beyond conventional parameters into distributed existence, spanning both materium and immaterium simultaneously, his apparent non-communication reflecting transcendence beyond concepts expressible through human language. Still others proposed that the enthroned figure represented strategic deception, the Emperor having transferred his essential being elsewhere after the confrontation with Horus, leaving psychically active corpse as distraction while he implemented long-term recovery strategy invisible to both allies and enemies. These competing interpretations remained academic, given the practical impossibility of verification. The Golden Throne's chamber remained accessible only to Adeptus Custodes, who maintained absolute silence regarding their observations. The Sisters of Silence, whose null field abilities might have provided objective assessment, had diminished in number and influence to extent that their perspectives carried minimal weight in imperial discourse. the psychically active individuals who claimed direct communication with the emperor, ranging from imperial saints to ecclesiarchy officials, invariably presented accounts aligned with their pre-existing theological positions, suggesting projection rather than objective reception. In absence of verifiable evidence, belief rather than knowledge determined individual positions regarding humanity's enthroned master. This epistemic uncertainty extended beyond the emperor's personal status to humanity's broader trajectory. The Great Crusade had presented unified narrative of species ascension, humanity reclaiming its rightful dominion over the galaxy while evolving towards psychic maturity that would establish permanent supremacy over both material and immaterial realms. This teleological framework, with its clear direction and purpose, had been shattered by the Horus Heresy, alongside the more concrete destruction of imperial military assets and governing institutions. The Imperium that emerged from this catastrophe maintained expansion rhetoric while implementing policies that prioritized preservation over progress. Its contradictory impulses, reflecting traumatized civilization, unable to reconcile idealized self-image with practical operational constraints. Over subsequent millennia, these contradictions accumulated rather than resolved. The Adeptus Mechanicus venerated technology while systematically preventing its evolution. The imperial cult worshipped the emperor as god while implementing policies directly contradicting his explicitly stated preferences. The Adeptus Administratum coordinated galactic governance while maintaining information restriction protocols that prevented effective coordination. The various branches of imperial military defended humanity while implementing security measures that constrained human potential more effectively than any external enemy. These paradoxical arrangements, each emerging from practical necessity rather than coherent design, gradually transformed the Imperium from functional civilization into self-perpetuating mechanism whose operations increasingly diverged from any recognizable human purpose. Throughout this entropic decline, the master of mankind endured in solitary sacrifice upon the Golden Throne. His physical body, sustained through technological means whose original purpose had been distorted beyond recognition, provided anchor for consciousness stretched across dimensions beyond material comprehension. The Astronomicon continued functioning through his unbending will, enabling warp navigation essential for maintaining minimal coherence across the Imperium's scattered domains. The immaterial predators that had corrupted half his sons remained contained primarily through his metaphysical opposition, their influence limited to regions where local conditions enabled manifestation rather than spreading unopposed across human-settled space. These fundamental services, provided through eternal suffering beyond mortal comprehension, represented invoice for humanity's continued existence, price paid willingly by being whose nature transcended designation as either human or divine. 10,000 years after the Horus Heresy, the Imperium of Man persisted as shambling echo of its original conception. The civilization that had been intended as humanity's vessel for evolutionary ascension had devolved into preservation mechanism focused on continued existence rather than advancement. The imperial truth rationalist philosophy, designed to eliminate superstition as limiting factor on human potential, had been replaced by religious dogma that systematically prevented intellectual progress. The Primarch's transhuman beings created to lead humanity beyond its biological limitations had disappeared from active participation in species development, leaving stunted institutions to interpret their legacies according to increasingly distorted understanding. These inversions, each representing failure of the Emperor's original vision, collectively defined civilization, sustained primarily through momentum rather than purpose. Yet even in this diminished state, the Imperium represented humanity's sole defense against hostility, both material and immaterial. Xenospecies ranging from barbaric orcs whose reproductive biology rendered conventional extermination impossible to enigmatic Aeldari, whose post-collapse civilization operated according to incomprehensible priorities presented persistent threats requiring coordinated military response beyond capability of fragmented human enclaves. The ruinous powers, immaterial entities that had orchestrated the Horus heresy as part of incomprehensibly longer game, continued seeking access to material reality through any available vector, their ultimate objectives transcending conventional understanding, while their immediate methodologies threatened everything recognizable as human civilization. Against these existential challenges, even the Imperium's flawed protection represented improvement over realistic alternatives. This grim calculation that even dystopian existence surpassed extinction as preferable outcome underpinned the Imperium's continued function despite its evident failures measured against the Emperor's original vision. The master of mankind himself, observing from perspectives spanning both materium and immaterium simultaneously, accepted this diminished implementation as necessary compromise rather than ideal outcome. His sacrifice upon the Golden Throne, physical form enduring in undying agony, while consciousness stretched across dimensions beyond human comprehension, represented acceptance of what could be achieved rather than what should have been possible. In this pragmatic adaptation rather than ideological purity lay the Emperor's true legacy, commitment to humanity's survival, transcending any particular vision for how that survival should manifest. The tragedy inherent in this compromise extended beyond merely personal cost to the Emperor himself. The Imperium's stabilization in form antithetical to his original design represented eternal monument to the limitations of even transhuman foresight when confronted with universe whose fundamental nature transcended rational comprehension. The Emperor had rejected religion as primitive misunderstanding, while failing to recognize spiritual dimension to reality that could not be eliminated through rational education. He had designed the Primarchs as perfected extensions of his will, without accounting for emotional needs inherent in their partially human nature. He had constructed empire around his personal authority, without establishing succession mechanisms adequate for inevitable transition. These architectural flaws in his grand design, each emerging from conceptual blind spots rather than implementation failures, demonstrated that even the master of mankind remained subject to limitations inherent in consciousness itself, perspective necessarily incomplete regardless of individual capability. This acknowledgement of inherent limitation, recognition that even the most exalted being remained fallible when measured against universe's total complexity, provided perhaps the only path toward genuine redemption for the Emperor's flawed creation. The Imperium, as actually existed, with all its contradictions and failures measured against original intent, represented not merely corruption of perfect design but necessary adaptation to reality, whose fundamental nature resisted perfect comprehension. Its continued existence, however diminished compared to theoretical ideal, testified to underlying resilience in human nature that transcended particular organizational forms or philosophical frameworks. The species endured despite everything: external threats, internal corruption, metaphysical challenges beyond conventional understanding, through stubborn determination that reflected the Emperor's own defining characteristic. In this shared persistence against overwhelming odds lay the true connection between humanity and its enthroned master. Not worship of perfection, but recognition of fundamental kinship in facing universe whose hostility transcended complete comprehension. The Emperor's sacrifice upon the Golden Throne mirrored countless human sacrifices across 10,000 years of desperate resistance against forces seeking humanity's extinction. The species and its creator shared not divinity but determined defiance against entropy, refusal to surrender despite mathematical inevitability of eventual defeat. This existential solidarity, rather than religious veneration or political organization, defined relationship that sustained both humanity and the being who had sought to guide its evolution. In shared suffering rather than transcendent ascension lay the bond that might eventually justify such tremendous cost. The Golden Throne stood silent in the deepest vault of the Imperial Palace, its mechanisms humming with energy beyond mortal comprehension. Upon this ancient device sat the withered form of humanity's master, broken but unbowed, suffering but enduring, sacrifice embodied in flesh sustained beyond natural termination. The Emperor of Mankind remained imprisoned between life and death. His consciousness stretched across dimensions, while his physical form endured in undying agony. 10,000 souls were sacrificed daily to maintain this twilight existence, their lives small offering compared to what their species' survival demanded. The Imperium continued diminished, corrupted, fallen from its intended glory but persistent against darkness that sought its final extinguishment. In this grim continuance, rather than triumphant ascension, lay humanity's actual destiny, not golden transcendence but stubborn endurance against universe fundamentally hostile to its existence. The Carrion Lord watched from his throne of sacrifice, and in his wisdom that transcended madness, he understood this was the best humanity could hope for in a galaxy of endless war.